Mm. Ecco. Buongiorno a tutti, bentrovati, good morning. This is the first of two sessions on the circulation of models. Today, we have had to change the order of the program a little bit. So we will start with Francesco Freddolini as our first speaker. He is Associate Professor of Modern Art History at La Sapienza, University of Rome. Previously, he taught at Luther College, University of Regina in Canada, where he also was director of the Humanities Research Institute. His fields of research include global art history in the early modern period, as well as the history of sculpture and collecting. He has published extensively on diverse topics regarding 16th and 17th century architecture and architectural sculpture, and this year he also had co-curated an important exhibition on the global Baroque in the 17th century, on display at the Scuderie del Quirinale here in Rome. And his paper today is entitled Raymond Leplat and the Networks of Sculpture Mobility from Carrara to the Nordic countries. And we look forward to learn more about this, please.
Thank you for the introduction. And first of all, thanks to the organizers for this conference and for having me as part of as one of the speakers. Thanks. On his way back to Copenhagen, at the end of the grand tour that took him to Italy in July 1709, King Frederick IV of Denmark ratified a defensive alliance with August the Strong and Frederick I of Prussia against Sweden. The alliance was celebrated by Samuel Theodor Gericke with this portrait depicting the three sovereigns in full regalia, holding hands, flanked by two sturdy columns, and standing on a carpet decorated with a golden triangle, an allusion to an agreement that could not be broken and a military alliance that could not be vanquished. In addition to holding hands on military and political matters, Frederick I of Prussia entertained the two kings in his most magnificent residences, Kaputz, Oranienburg, Berlin, Charlottenburg, and made sure that they were present at the baptism of his daughter, Friederike Sophie Wilhelmine, on July the 12th. This event was the culmination of a display of courtly splendor that resonated with the turn-of-the-century Germanophone rulers across Europe and beyond. Several replicas of Gericke's painting were made, and one of them was given to Thomas Wentworth, the third Earl of Strafford, who took part in the meetings as British envoy. And the one that you see on the screen is the painting that was given to Thomas Wentworth, as the inscription demonstrates. The display of magnificence deployed by Frederick I of Prussia must have ignited conversations about art patronage and collecting. We should not forget that Frederick IV of Denmark was on his way back home from a period spent in Italy where he commissioned some paintings, but more importantly, sculptures and architectural elements, especially from the sculptor and marble entrepreneur Giovanni Baratta. I have explored this particular part of the story elsewhere, so I'm just going to recapitulate it very briefly. Frederick IV ordered a monumental statue of Hercules and the Nemean lion from Baratta, later installed in the Hercules Pavilion in the garden of the Rosenborg Castle in Copenhagen, together with two statues of Orpheus and Eurydice. The commission was only the beginning. Baratta, in 1709, spent time in his homeland, Carrara, to provide columns and other architectural elements for Frederick IV, and over the following years he worked intensely for the Danish king as a court sculptor. Most of the marble decorations that adorned Frederick IV's palaces were made in Carrara by Giovanni Baratta. Today, I would like to reflect on how this meeting between the three kings and the Earl of Strafford was a key turning point in the transnational pan-European mobility of sculpture from Italy, and especially Carrara and Rome, and I would like to explore how graphic media, drawings, and especially prints, provided crucial support for this mobility and gave resonance to a shared taste in sculpture across Europe. To do so, I will investigate Raymond Leplat, Recueil de marbre antique qui se trouve dans la Galerie du Roi de Pologne à Dresden, published in 1733, focusing on its making, its purpose, and its context. First, I would like to go through some sculptural commissions that followed Frederick IV's marble acquisitions from Baratta. In 1714, the Earl of Strafford received a proposal from the British Council in Livorno to order marble architectural elements and sculpture from Giovanni Baratta, mentioning the work that the sculptor had completed for the Danish king. And I quote, "I've ordered the 4 columns and bases and capitals, the 4 pedestals for statues, and the 4 plasters of a fine white marble with a dark blue vein, which is the best and prettiest this country affords." One Signor Baratta did some very fine ones for the King of Denmark. And he has a respect for the English. He'll be very proud of being employed for your lordships, not only on this, but likewise for the statue. End quote. Strafford did meet Frederick IV in Berlin, as we've just seen, and certainly this reference to the Danish king's patronage struck a chord. Furthermore, it is remarkable that in the same years, and after this meeting in Berlin, even Frederick I of Prussia commissioned works from Giovanni Baratta. As Baratta's biographer Giovanni Maria Niccolò Gabburri wrote, the sculptor made very fine urns for him, decorated with bas-relief. Unfortunately, these urns have never been found, and maybe they have been destroyed during World War II. However, it is worth noting that shortly after the 1709 meeting, each court initiated substantial sculptural programs. Augustus Strong expanded the Zwinger and Dresden gardens, Frederick I monumentalized Berlin, and Frederick IV introduced new sculptural cycles in Copenhagen and the Danish palaces complexes. They all looked at Italy, and particularly Carrara, and they were not alone. England was an important player in this arena, as we've just seen, and we shouldn't forget that the British and Danish dynasties were related. Most of the negotiations between patrons and sculptors took place through intermediaries, as we have seen with the British envoy in Livorno, and through the exchange of drawings. Most of these drawings are lost, but they are often mentioned in letters written to negotiate sculptors and their shipments. In some circumstances, similar drawings were sent to several potential patrons to propose sculptures. Baratta, for example, had drawings sent to England by the Grand Ducal Ambassador Jacopo Giraldi of his statues of Eurydice and Orpheus, even though they ended up in Copenhagen. And here you see two letters mentioning these two statues, these two very statues that were sent by Giraldi with the accompanying drawings. And they were sent to England. Giraldi talks about these two statues, and he sends the drawings during the same weeks when Frederick IV is in Florence visiting Baratta's studio, and then he kind of snatches these two statues, and they ended up in Copenhagen without, and they're not finished. If we look at the flowers, for example, they're only roughly kind of sketched. There was some serious competition here among patrons of sculptors. This opens up an important issue of shared taste on a transnational level, an issue that is inherently connected with the dissemination of drawings and especially of prints. In his essay for the catalogue of the important 2006 exhibition Splendeur de la Cour des Saxe, Dresde à Versailles, Thomas Gidkens lucidly pointed out how around 1700, and I quote, les princes électeurs allemands semblent rivaliser en dépenses de prestige. Pour faire montre de leur règne, ils se surpassent en fêtes, en grandes constructions, en manifestations musicales, en collections d'objets d'art et de sumptueuses de costumes. Les mécénats répondaient à leur volonté de s'affirmer face à la concurrence. Les arts, l'architecture, les fêtes et le luxe dispendieux de cour étaient autant de démonstrations de dignité et de pouvoir. End quote. Exchanging prints and drawings, much easier to mobilize than other mediums, fueled the development of a common canon. A canon that in many instances did not leave much space for the individual qualities of each artist. The subtle differences pertaining to connoisseurship and connoisseurs inspecting the artworks in a gallery. This is important when we consider that most of the sculptural decorations, especially for palaces, interiors, and gardens, were commissioned when gallery displays of pictures were organized according to the school of paintings, and masters were highly sought after because of their specificity. None of these criteria applied to sculpture. Instead, we witness a population of statues invading gardens and decorating niches, walls, and door frames across Europe and beyond. Due to the time constraints of this paper, I will only briefly mention the British patronage and will only nod to the French patronage of sculpture, with Versailles becoming a model among Germanophone courts. And I use this term, Germanophone, to cover a ground that is larger than Germany and the Empire. Let's just not forget that, for example, Frederick IV of Denmark wrote his own journal in German. He used to speak German during his daily activities. It is worth noting that this process started well before the massive commissions of statues by Peter the Great for St. Petersburg. Russian patronage has been extensively studied, especially by Sergei Androsov, but has been relatively isolated from its wider context, the context of the competition for splendor and social distinction among the courts of Europe. Carrara was the key, even when commissions involved other centers, such as Venice. It was the key because that's where white marble came from, but also because many of the sculptors involved had a deep connection with Carrara. One of them was Pietro Baratta, active in Venice, but in reality a Carrarese sculptor and based in the large family workshop located in the city of the marble quarries. He was, after all, Giovanni's brother, and his connection with Carrara was not limited to blood ties. When he received the title of Scultore di Moscovia, court sculptor to Peter the Great, he was in Carrara and sent his works from there, exactly as his brother did when he was working for Copenhagen or Berlin. It was an operative model that the Baratta family established and enabled them to send their works across the entire continent. August the Strong, who entertained conversations with Frederick IV of Denmark in 1709 and was deeply interested in commissioning artworks to decorate his palace and gardens in Dresden, followed in the Danish king's footsteps. Giovanni Baratta was not available, having been basically monopolized by Frederick IV. However, Pietro Baratta stepped in, and together with a group of other sculptors based in Venice, provided a large number of sculptures for the sovereigns. Most of these works have been dispersed or destroyed during World War II. We still have Corradini's works, for example, but all of Baratta's statues are lost except one, Francesco Baratta's Lucrezia, the exception. It has been repurposed as Mary Magdalene and preserved in the Katholische Hofkirche in Dresden. However, we can reconstruct their number and their aspect from the prints that illustrated Raymond Leplat's catalogue of August the Strong sculpture collections, published in Dresden in 1733. Pietro Baratta, together with Francesco, provided allegories of glory, valor, magnificence, and magnanimity. This is interesting for several reasons. These virtues were not only quite appropriate for a sovereign, but also the same that Giovanni Baratta carved for the facade of Palazzo Madama in Turin, under the direction of Filippo Juvarra in 1721. We do not know the exact date of August the Strong's commission for the statues, but considering that his massive acquisition of sculptures culminated in the 1720s, and especially in 1728, when Raymond Leplat secured for him the Chigi and Albani collections of antiquities. Similar statues were installed in St. Petersburg by Peter the Great, who was also part of the alliance against Sweden. Politics, diplomacy, and taste went hand in hand. Raymond Leplat, a francophone Flemish architect, worked for August the Strong as an agent for artistic acquisitions in Paris and Italy during the second and third decade of the century. He also edited the volume with illustration that celebrated and catalogued the sovereign's collection of antiquities and contemporary sculpture. Leplat's illustrated catalogue came after a long line of catalogues. Roman collections such as the Giustiniani from the 17th century, or the Raccolta di Statue Antiche e Moderne by Maffei and De Rossi, published in 1704, were illustrious precedents. Maffei and De Rossi's volume, with its full-page illustrations, and especially the combination of classical and modern statues, provided an important example for Leplat, who decided to pursue the same organizational pattern. This is particularly significant if we consider that the Leplat's publication project began in 1728, in the wake of the acquisition of Cardinal Albani's collection of antiquities for 20,000 scudi. It may not be a coincidence that the format of the Raccolta di Statue Antiche e Moderne inspired August the Strong for his own catalogue, since the Roman book had been promoted by Pope Clement XI Albani. Raymond Leplat certainly knew Maffei and De Rossi, and the format, with a full-page illustration isolating the statues against a neutral background and including all of them within a rectangular frame with a caption at the bottom, is extremely similar. Likewise, the concept of the volume is similar, with the inclusion of both antiquities and modern sculptures, an approach that diverged from 17th century illustrated catalogues such as the Galleria Giustiniana, for example. The titles themselves, Raccolta and Recueil, provide an unquestionable intertextual evidence that Leplat had Maffei and the Rossi volume had in mind as a model. To a trained early 18th century reader, a translation that so actively referenced the previous book must have been tantamount to an explicit comparison with a famous model. a comparison between publications, and in turn, a comparison between collections and collectors. A similar combination of antiquities and contemporary artworks had been adopted in France in the Cabinet du Roi. This ambitious project, aimed at reproducing the entire collection of Louis XIV, initiated by the king himself and implemented by Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Leplat was certainly aware of this project, since he spent years in Paris looking for artworks and furnishings for Auguste the Strong, and his ties with the French art scene were obviously strong. The language choice for the publication of Auguste the Strong, Recueil, is also an eloquent connection to France. However, the Cabinet du Roi was a project of a much grander scale. It spanned a much larger and more complex gamut of objects, collections, and commissions. It was not contained in one volume, but combined instead loose prints and volumes that were subsequently reassembled in diverse forms. And more importantly, the agency and the work of printmakers was based on different premises and led to different results. Leplat hired Anna Maria Werner for the drawings after the statues, antique and modern ones. And the artists embarked in a major production of over 200 drawings for the engravers, in addition to the complex frontispiece. Werner's involvement in this commission, which thus far has not been adequately investigated, merits further attention, and I plan to expand on it in the written version of this paper. Due to the time constraints today, I would just like to point out how during a period when women artists were still often obliged to be portraitists and did not have regular access to the male nude, not even mediated by statuary, this commission is a rare exception and one that needs serious attention, as the print on the right-hand side of this screen, I hope, shows. Leplat's Recueil in 1733 became much more than a catalogue. It transposed on paper the mobility of sculpture from south to north, and it can be seen as the visual epicenter of the circulation of statuary from Carrara, from Rome, from Italy, towards the Nordic countries. This publication is a node within a much larger and much more complex network. A network that involved Scandinavia, as we have seen with the Danish king, other German electorates, as well as Russia. Peter the Great, who started commissioning statues from Pietro Baratta and other sculptors based in Venice, was also part of the anti-Swedish League formed in 1709 in Berlin. Sculpture populating palaces and gardens became a token of a shared taste linking courts across Europe and beyond. In France, since the establishment of the Academy in Rome, and thanks to Louis XIV's patronage and its own national industry of sculpture, to borrow from Jennifer Montagu's lexicon, and marble decorative elements, other countries in Central and Northern Europe established different patterns. Such patterns, and I'm heading to the conclusion here, such patterns could have been cemented by political alliances such as the Anti-Swedish League formed in 1709, but at the same time transcended such conflicts. I argue that Nicodemus Tessin the Younger travels, taste, and theoretical approach and works inspired and fuel this Nordic network, so to speak. If we look at the sculptural furnishing that traversed Germanophone countries, and I keep using this definition, this term, Germanophone countries, and the typologies of sculptures, the artists involved, the formats, destination, and iconography, we see something more than a shared taste. Many of the ideas had been fixed on paper in terms of drawings, but also through manuscripts and printed paper by Nicodemus Tessin the Younger. Hercules in an audience room populated by sculptures that were similar to those commissioned just a few years later by the Danish king Frederick IV, or by Frederick I in Prussia, or August the Strong in Venice. But there is more. In 1712, Tessin published the catalogue of his library and collection of prints. Many of these books and prints are now preserved in published Sweden collections and enable us to reconstruct Tessin's theoretical studies as well as the models he aspired to. This catalog, studied by Martin Olin, and once again is a potential tool to understand the centripetal force of mobility towards a node that could subsequently spread ideas through a larger network. The repertory gathered by Tessin, especially considering his institutional role in Sweden, became the benchmark against which Nordic countries compared their taste, collecting, and patronage, especially in terms of marble ornaments. And I'm using this terminology because I want to include sculpture as well as architectural elements. And I'm showing you a page more overtly devoted to architecture per se, as well as another one with sculpture, funerary monuments, as two pages that show even the variety of interests that were gathered, assembled by this man. By looking at these pages, we witness the formation of a canon that traversed Europe, and the graphic arts agency in shaping and crystallizing the canon that cannot be underestimated. Frederick IV in Copenhagen knew. Frederick I and August the Strong knew as well. And this competition existed in a context where print culture played a pivotal role. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesco, for this very rich paper on circulation, not only of ideas, but also materials and sculptures as media for politics, diplomatics, and taste, as you very eloquently put it. I hope we can have time for some questions at the end of the session. But I now welcome Martin Olin to the floor. He received his doctorate in art history from Lund University in 2000 with the dissertation Det karolinska porträttet, ideologi, ikonografi, identitet. The Carolingian portrait, ideology, iconography, identity. He became associate professor of art history at Uppsala University in 2008, and he has mainly worked at the Nationalmuseum in Stockholm, where he has been director of the collections department since 2023, and previously director of the research department. As a scholar, Olin has worked with the collections of Nicodemus Tessin the Younger and published a number of thematic articles as well as a catalogue of Tessin's drawings for church architecture. And he's also, well, he knows this building well. He was deputy director here at the Swedish Institute in Rome from 2013 to 15, where he taught Italian architectural history from the Renaissance to the present. And today, he will talk about Nicodemus Tessin's Italian palaces for the kings of France and Sweden. Please, Martin.
Thank you, and thank you for organizing this fascinating colloquium. So do I just push this, or are you? Okay, good. So my prologue scene is the court of Sweden at Christmas 1698. The young king, Charles XII, absolute ruler at the age of 16, spends a few dark afternoons looking at architectural prints with his architect, Nicodemus Tessin the Younger. And he writes to his agent in Paris. His Majesty the King takes much pleasure in the arts and sciences. A mark of this is that he, since 3 weeks on feast days, has had the patience to spend his time from chapel service until supper, turning over the leaves in my volumes of prints and engravings, where the various subjects provide 1,000 topics for discourse, and they will give him, should it please him to study, an extensive knowledge of everything that is vast in Europe. And I assure you that I do not know anyone in Sweden more capable of conversing on such matters than the king. He will be dedicated to magnificence and wishes only to hear of that which is great and vast. Tessin, as we can see, had great hopes for the future of princely architecture in Sweden. And these hopes were not extinguished when Charles XII left Sweden 18 months later to pursue a war against Russia, Saxonia, and Denmark. But in reality, due to the war, that would go on until the death of the king in 1718. It meant that Tessin's architectural projects for the monarchy, almost completely, with the exception of the royal palace, would remain on paper. Nicodemus Tessin would have been a very enthusiastic supporter of this symposium and the research project, which is its point of departure. And he has been mentioned several times, also this morning. And Tessin esteemed nothing as much as an architectural print, preferably large scale and bound together with other similar prints in large folio volumes. In distant Stockholm, prints were absolutely essential to his activities. He made no secret of this, and as we heard Professor Freddolini say, he was so proud of his collection that he published a catalogue of his library and prints collection in 1712. Tessin was always trying to get hold of any new prints of interest appearing on the international market. And therefore, he could not have been more delighted when two young noblemen returning from Rome in 1702 presented him unexpectedly with a new book with high-quality prints, with measurements of his favorite subjects, that is, Roman architecture, from Michelangelo to Bernini. And this was the first volume of Domenico de Rossi's Studio dell'Architettura Civile. The Turnsflix luggage from Italy has arrived. The elder brother has presented me with a thick volume that has been engraved in Rome, of the ornaments of windows, doors, etc., of that which is most remarkable in Rome, and of which is promised yet another volume. The first one is quite large and contains many beautiful things, and it can be counted as one of the best books on architecture ever printed. So this was a golden age of printing, and we already saw in the previous lecture a frontispiece of another important publication by the Rossi publishing house. And around 15 years ago, I was asked by the late Aloisio Antinori to contribute to another print project about the importance of prints produced by the De Rossi publishing house at Santa Maria della Pace, alla Pace, as it's often called. And Tessin's admiration for the prints of the studio, it was not difficult to see how they had been essential for the design of the Royal Palace of Stockholm, such as the central window of the south facade, mentioned already on Tuesday by Professor Rocca de Amicis. The gift of the studio in the Architettura Civile was very timely, as Tessin in 1702 was immersed in the work with the facades of the Stockholm Palace. In May 1704, he wrote to Charles XII that all the plans of Your Majesty's palace, with all the particulars, are ready. And he sent not the drawings, but he sent, as they were finished, the prints, one at a time or two at a time, to the king's camp. So, what should he turn his attention to now? So, there is one palace project which Tessin admired more than anything else. And it was not any of the palazzi of the Roman nobility or the clergy, but something even grander. In fact, the greatest and most prestigious project imaginable to him. It left him no peace and had fascinated him for decades. This project was Gian Lorenzo Bernini's design for the Château du Louvre in Paris. And this is an extremely fascinating history, which I will not go into, but the French architectural connoisseurs and politicians and the king had asked Bernini to come to Rome to make a design for New Rome, for a new Louvre, which was refused after a complicated and painful process. Bernini wanted to make the Louvre, make it much more French, and this was absolutely in line with Tessin's ideals, and he had admired this project for a long time, and he was not content with the existing prints, as they were not detailed enough for him to work from, as it were, to take details from. So he ordered specially made drawings by French draftsmen from the model, from the maquette, large-scale wooden model of the project that was still to be viewed in Paris. And these are still important sources to the exact details of Bernini's project. So at some instances, and Tessin was very aware of this, the existing prints were not enough, so you'd have to sort of complement them. And this is Bernini's plan for the Louvre, as engraved by Jean Marot. And what you can see is that he wanted to change the inner courtyard and covering up the French architecture already existing there. And Tessin thought that why not suggest a renewed version, another version of this, sort of going on from where Bernini had left off. So immediately when he has finished the royal palace, and of course the building of the palace has slowed down because of the war, so there's not much building activity going on. So Tessin immediately goes back to the office and starts drawing another enormous palace, even larger this time. Of course, using his experiences with designing the royal palace, but also using a lot of his international models, his Italian models. And here you can see how he decides to, instead of keeping the square courtyard, he inserts a circular courtyard inside the Cour de Marbre, the large, or the Cour Carrée, the large square courtyard of the Louvre. And he extends the wings towards the west, and this would actually is what happened in the 19th century. Of course, they were not looking at Tessin, but this was a sort of natural way of going to connect the Louvre with the Palais de Tuileries, which was already from the beginning called Bath's plan. And he makes another model. So he makes a model of this because he has seen Bernini's model of the Louvre. So he produces a model and sends his student Göran Josué Adelkrantz to present this at the court in Paris. And the French architects and the French courtiers look at it, and they are, of course, not really interested in this. They will, the king is firmly established at Versailles, and he is. The French architectural establishment is not interested in these Roman solutions. But nevertheless, it's an impressive project, and Adelkrantz reports back. And what Tessin's great rival, or the person he sort of sees as his rival, is Jules Lardouin Mansart, the French royal architect. and Mansart doesn't show up for this first discussion. And Adelkrans and people sort of whisper. You really get the sense of this sort of rather bitchy atmosphere at the French court. And there's a French courtier that comes towards, so Mansart is not there, and this French courtier that comes towards Adelkrans and sort of mouths. He speaks very low, with a very low voice, and he says, jalousie, jealousy. And I don't know if that was really the case, but Tessin thought that he would then obliterate the French architecture of the 16th and early 17th century and completely destroy this, and this would just be for the good, which had also been Bernini's view, and this, of course, irritated the French. This circular courtyard would be based on in a way, it's Palladio's Basilica at Vicenza, but turned into a sort of an interior courtyard. And it would be connected with the palace with four staircases in the corners, with 4 fountains representing the 4 rivers of France. And you can see as he's sort of keeping close to the model, but he's also changing it a bit. You can see in the lower register, he decides to put the Doric columns on pedestals, thereby depriving the Doric order of some of its vigor and classical character, making it more French in a way. And Palladio was of interest to him in these years, and I'm just showing this example that Kristoffer Neville also mentioned the other day with his project for Stockholm, where he wants to cover up the Storkyrkan with this Palladian scheme. But here he also changes the order from the Corinthian order of Palazzo Thiene to a Doric order. And here just the parallel again. So nothing comes out of this. But there is a sort of formal critique sent back to Stockholm. And Tessin immediately gets back to this project and starts, I'll revise. So he revises it and has a second project with a square courtyard. And there are very interesting drawings for this, as you can see, richly annotated. And this time he adjusts a little bit to the French taste. At Versailles, he hated Versailles. He thought that the exterior architecture of Ardoin and Mansart was terrible, but he nevertheless adjusts a little bit to it with this rusticated basement or first ground floor and a raised first floor and then a small attic. And this project is also, there are interesting notes where you see how he's really sampling from his models, from the prints and some possibly drawings, but mostly prints, where he mentions exactly the sources and how he thinks they can be of use. And this project is sent, the Louvre project is sent to Paris, but not as a model. It's sent with Carl Gustaf Tessin, his son, to present, but this is in 1715, and Louis XIV is ill, and he dies before seeing it. So it's presented later on to the regent, but in the form of drawings, and is not made much notice of. And the original drawings, which were large scale, have disappeared. In these years, Tessin, this is not the only project he was working on. And the king was established. Charles XII was established in Bender, where he received the missives, the letters from the court, and also engravings and drawn plans from Tessin, who used this as a way of keeping the interest of the king, who was rather bored and fixed and couldn't move around freely. So this was a way also ingratiating him, and these projects became larger and larger and wilder. As we will see, there's one particular project that I'm going to conclude this presentation with, the project for a Lustslott, a country palace, a pleasure palace in the countryside for Charles XII. known not from any finished drawings, but from a number of sketches preserved in two collections in the National Museum and in a private collection and called Vasasamlingen, run by a Swedish, kept by a Swedish private foundation. And this rather fascinating, very inky, dark facade is one of the drawings for this project. I will come back to it, and I will present an interpretation of it. But the first and the most readable, the most easy to understand is this project, which I prefer to call Project A, where we see a facade, a plan, and a section. And this plan it seems very large, but it's actually where you see all the dots in 4 places. These are sort of garden parterres. So if you imagine this as a sort of 2 letter H's attached to a square, perhaps easier to see here, it's a system of these sort of rather long wings, galleries, and which end in pavilions, and around a circular or an oval courtyard with a big fountain. And this here he returns a bit to this sort of the oval, the round courtyard. He's thinking of the Palazzo Farnese at Caprarola and his own project for the Louvre. And this is also meant to be a palace for art collections and display of sculpture, and paintings, and books. And this is and this project, strangely, have some of Tessin's most beautiful, if you're allowed to call them beautiful, but I think they are his most attractive drawings from a more sort of artistic point of view. You can see that he's really sort of thinking as he draws. And this drawing, I'm not alone in this. Also, Ragnar Josefsson misinterpreted it, that it looks like a fascinating new idea with sort of corner pavilions. And I have even shown this slide before, making a comparison to the almost contemporary designs for Blenheim Palace. But that's an actual misreading, whereas this is a side facade. So this is a projection. If you're looking from the side, you see the higher pavilions, but they are the ones in the center. So it's a bit more boring than I first thought. And these drawings for this project are sort of collected in a sort of folder with a lot of numerous notes. And these notes often refer to these models that he has, sometimes, but not always, with a sort of actual reference. And they are really sort of illustrating his thought process and his design and creative way of working. He goes back to the Louvre project again with the ground floor and then a raised first floor, here with a section for the chapel. And to the lower right, there is one of the corner pavilions with a sort of an octagonal plan for a library, which was also included in the Louvre project. Here is for a section of a part with a staircase, a bit similar to the Stockholm Palace one. And here he is elaborating the facades, thinking perhaps of having a belvedere attached to a part of the facade. And here is a fair copy of the central section with the staircases, double staircases, and the oval courtyard. And I think this is more or less what this final project that was drawn up in large-scale drawings and sent to the king looked like. And the king thanks him for this through his secretary, Karsten Pfeiffer. And the left part of this slide is actually a later drawing, probably by Carl Hollemann, which is a sort of maybe a copy of an existing drawing or something that records this project. So what about the other project and the first one I shown, the dark drawing? So I've done a little bit of forensic work here. So this is one of the drawings for this project. And it has an inscription where it talks about the Cavaliere Bernino, and it talks about Palladio, and it would have been interesting to know precisely what he thought, but maybe you could sort of reconstruct that. But there's actually no need to do that, because actually Tessin has written this. When Tessin did make these notes, the sheet had already been torn, but he just continues on the one beneath. So from this we can conclude that these notes are made after the drawings, that he goes back to his drawings and makes annotations as he finds out new ideas. And this is also a note found with this project. And there it says, towards the middle, that nel secondo tomo del studio d'architettura si ritrovano 10 nuove foglie concernant, I think it's French, il Palazzo di Caprarola, and so on. And he also says that here you also find prints of the pianta del Palazzo della Villa Pamfiglia. And the second volume of the Studio dell'Architettura Civile comes out in 1712, so that would have been nice for this. But the prints he mentions are in the third volume, and this third volume does not come out until 1721. So I think that Tessin returns to this project in 1721 and sort of creates yet another version of it, inspired, I would argue, in part by the prints in the last volume of the Studio d'Architettura Civile. And for instance, this drawing is, I think it's amazing, but it's damaged, as you can see, by the iron gall ink that has sort of bitten through in some places. But these access ramps, it's obviously located in a position where it's sort of high up on one side. And in the same collection, in the Vasa Samling, and there's this great plan for a palace set in a garden with fountains, and huge. It's almost 3 meters wide. And in 1980, Margareta Reuterskiöld published a good article in Konsthistorisk Tidskrift, actually combining these two, because if you look, people have been looking mostly at the garden design, but if you look at the plan and if you look at this facade, you can actually see that this is the facade for this plan, where Tessin goes back to a semicircular version of his old courtyard idea for the Louvre, and I think perhaps also looking at the Bernini's first Louvre project, which we saw a glimpse of yesterday. And I think in these the lateral wings, he seems to have these sort of very rusticated Doric columns. Perhaps this is a new interest in Palladio coming back to him. And I would even venture to say that these ramps may be something he thinks of after having looked at the Caprarola prints. So, what's the garden facade looking like? And working on this, with these drawings are kept this rather pedestrian and not so fascinating drawing at the lower right, but I actually think it is the garden facade for this project, not by Tessin, but by another draftsman trying to interpret his version. And you may say that actually, well, they don't look the same, but if you look at the inky drawing, it actually has a flap. And below this flap, and this is an image I haven't got hold of, there is this dome version. So he's sort of elaborating this idea, thinking that perhaps it's not so interesting in the end. So you can see that there's also quite a big level of a difference in level. So I think this shows us a bit more about this project. But where is it from? Where is it for? Where is it going to be? There's rather a discussion about this, because Tessin says something in one place, and someone says that it's 1.5 lieu outside Stockholm. I think that's around 5 kilometers. But also Upplands Väsby is mentioned, and Margareta Reuterskiöld thinks Ulvsunda. But one idea is that it was for Norra Djurgården, for area around Loddeviken, where Charles XI's fishing cabin, Fiskartorpet, was situated. And perhaps a sort of similar project would have been more adapted to the available financial resources in 1721, but this was a bit far from Tessin's way of thinking. So, and we also have this drawing that we know that he's interested in the temple of, build a sort of temple for Diana, and have a pavilion on Fiskartorpsberget. And Fiskartorpsberget, there's a sort of ski jump station right now. But I'm suggesting here that Tessin is imagining this as the end of a very long perspective, and that this may be the intended place for this project at Norra Djurgården, starting with a palace close to the current student housing area, Stora Lappkärrsberget, and sort of looking south toward Fiskartorpsberget. And this is the sort of modern reference image where it would have been placed. But this is a rather sort of new thought. But I hope that this presentation has allowed me to say something about how Tessin worked with prints in his creative process, and perhaps even if it's exaggerated, I think it's a good illustration. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fantastic presentation and for having us look into Tessin's collecting and planning and testing out designs and ideas. We have had some problems with the third paper in this session. There were some problems with the presentation. So I think since it's 10:30 now, I think we postpone that paper until the next session and have a coffee break now. But if there are any questions for Martin and Francesco, we can take them before we have coffee. No question? Yes, please.
Yes, to repeat, the question is whether it would have been perceived as disloyal to send a project to the King of France, working for France, while he was the Swedish King's project. Well, I think France was less of a problem, because France was an ally of Sweden and a superpower, and it would have been, just been an honor. And the ambassador, or the court of Louis XIV communicated with the Swedish ambassador with the French ambassador in Stockholm, saying how nice it was that the Swedish architect had presented this. So this was good diplomatic relations. But I think the more difficult relationship was the one we talked about a bit yesterday with Denmark, with him drawing. I didn't have time to talk about that, making a design for a palace for the King of Denmark. But even that worked out, and perhaps it was also in that case more of a sort of case of soft diplomacy. So that was, it's not really an issue, and he would have asked some kind of permission, I suppose. He wasn't doing it in secret. But I think, even though I don't know much about what happened then, but then in the 20s he offered his services to Peter the Great, which I would consider a bit sort of hard to stomach, to be honest.
I think we can allow one more question, if there is one. If not,
we have the great expert, Daniela Del Pesco, the great expert of Vanini's Louvre project, which we sort of. Could you say something about how Tessin's project was seen from a French point of view? Do you know anything about that? Sa qualcosa di come era percepito in Francia i progetti di Tessin?
Dovrei rinfrescarmi la memoria su delle mie letture. Penso che nel momento che Tessin presenta il suo progetto, le carte erano già messe sul tavolo con i progetti del gruppo misto Perrault, Levaux, mettendo dei nomi che poi non erano tutti attivi. Anche Lebrun aveva cercato di infilarsi dentro. Credo che a quel momento, non so se siete d'accordo, il disegno, diciamo, attribuito a Claude Perrault della colonnade era quello già, diciamo, accettato, con la coscienza sporca, che è un progetto che prende molto da Bernini. Dopo che nei promemoria fanno prediche contro le coperture piatte, la colonnade di Perrault ha il tetto piatto, e così l'uso di un colonnato che comunque crea ombra nelle stanze che stanno dietro le colonne. Parliamo della facciata est. Penso che la cosa interessante di Tessin è questo sforzo che ha fatto di interpretare, anche lui cercando, come aveva fatto tanto Bernini, di dare una chiave francese a una impostazione che, come ha spiegato benissimo Martin, è legata agli esempi italiani. Perché una cosa su cui penso che bisogna insistere moltissimo è che Bernini, nei suoi 4, perché possiamo dire sono 4 progetti, cerca di avvicinarsi, di ascoltare le osservazioni dei promemoria di Colbert. E così mi sembra che anche il progetto di Tessin in qualche modo cerca una via, non è che va con la sua testa, usando quella tradizione che a lui sta più a cuore, diciamo, che lui stima di più, cioè quella che è venuta fuori dalle vicende di un nuovo, dobbiamo ricordarci che è un grande nuovo tema, cioè l'idea del palazzo reale così grande effettivamente comincia forse con Enrico IV, quando comincia l'allungamento del Louvre, eccetera, eccetera. No? Non so se ho risposto.
Grazie.
Okay, I think we will give Martin and Francesco a hand. And then we will have a coffee break, a little bit shorter than scheduled, and reunite again at 11. Thank you. Ma
Sono Pichetto. Una cosa, ho notato adesso che il file che avevo prima avevo come modifica 10, 12 e questo invece non serve.
Ancora lasciamo perché non so perché. Un attimo risolvo un'altra cosa. Roma.
giustamente in anticipo,
Sì,
come
esatto.
come le poche, sì. No, ma questo no, come adesso non voglio
No, ma comunque
fare
quella sono
spoiler.
23 pagine. Sì, sì. Al massimo sarebbe quella.
No, è quello, ma...
Ma no,
No, visto che, sì, infatti, ma visto che purtroppo lei è una delle due che ha mandato in anticipo senza Yes. I don't wear one. For these occasions, it's very nice to have. It's a bit clumsy. Look at the whole lot.
Let's start again. Ricominciamo adesso. So a little change of program as you see. So I will also present this last speaker in the previous session before I afterwards give the word to the moderator of the last session, Kristoffer Neville. And I will also take this opportunity to say to all the speakers the rest of the day that please be careful to keep your allotted time. Otherwise, our program we're already behind schedule, and let's not make that delay even larger. So our last speaker in this session, or the previous session, is Gjert Vestrheim of the University of Bergen in Norway. He is a professor of Greek, and his main interest being Greek poetry and the reception of Greek and Roman literature. But he's also interested in architecture and the reception of ancient architecture in the European tradition. And his most important publication on architecture is Bergens arkitekturen 1660 til 1850, The Architecture of Bergen from 1660 to 1850. And he has also worked on historical garden design, especially the Baroque garden. And today he will share with us insights from both these fields. And I suppose you will do that. And I think that his paper will be an interesting continuation of Martin's paper on Tessin. The country villas of Bergen 1660 to 709. Please, Gjert.
Yes, thank you. And just to explain, the year 709 is the year of Poltava, which means the war started and all building ended for 50 years at least. So my area is clearly defined. It starts with absolutism in 1660, it ends in 1709. Almost. Well, this, as I hope you can see, is the main example of Baroque pilaster architecture in Norway. It's not big, but the pilasters are properly made and evenly spaced, and they're made by Italian craftsmen who went on to St. Petersburg afterwards. You'll also notice that the windows are evenly spaced and they are vertically aligned. Now this is a variation on the same theme, built of wood. As you can see, the central part has a pediment supported by a giant order of 2 pilasters in the corners. The classically trained eye would want 2 more pilasters between the windows. There's also a smaller order on the ground floor, as you can see, between the windows. But the pilasters are quite far apart, divided by groups of 2 windows. The facade is made of wood paneling, while the core of the building is timber. And please note, behind the paneling, you will not find this. This is the sort of frame-built timber house that you will find all the way from Denmark to France and England. Fachwerk in German. It's a construction of post and lintel with infill of lighter materials. If you build like this, you will want your posts evenly spaced, like the columns of a temple. And therefore, the openings will also be evenly spaced. The houses of the north are different. Behind the paneling of a Norwegian house, you will find this. This is loft. Loft is horizontal logs interlocking in the corners. Note how the logs of an internal wall are locked into the facade to the right of the door. You all see that, to the right of the door, logs protruding. In these houses, the whole wall is load-bearing, and therefore every single opening weakens the construction. On the other hand, timber can easily span large openings. So you will want your house to have fewer and larger openings between broad expanses of wall. Such houses are often covered with paneling. This picture shows the construction. Here we have stone architecture realized in wood. The pilasters are hiding the locks of the internal timber walls. But the windows here are so large that they weaken the construction, and therefore the house needs extra bracing. Between the windows, you see pilasters alternating with somewhat slimmer braces. The pilasters are part of the architecture. They are there on the architect's drawing. The braces are not. The braces were added by the craftsman. Between them, the walls are covered with overlapping vertical boards, so-called vertical paneling. That's not easy to see here, but there's vertical weatherboards all the way. And behind it is a timber construction of the same kind as the last picture. Now here, the imitation of stone is taken one step further. The paneling is not overlapping, it's smooth to imitate plaster, except on the first floor, where it imitates rustication. But once you start thinking through your materials and try adapting your models to the structural properties of wood, this is what you get. These houses are from the Bergen area. In Bergen, the paneling is always overlapping horizontally, not vertically. The windows are brought closely together in groups of 2 or 3. The pilasters are discarded because the rhythm of classical pilasters does not agree with the rhythm of the windows. You want few large groups of windows and not the regular alternating of classical architecture. So the pilasters are discarded, and once the pilasters are discarded, there's no need to align the first floor windows with those on the ground floor. As you can see, the window grouping on the first floor is different from the ground floor. Now, what do you do instead? To create unity, the same group of windows is repeated on both floors, either 2 windows or 3. 2 windows to the left, 2 to the right, and 2 on the first floor, or 3 floors, 3 windows. And another thing, the facade is carefully proportioned. Typically, the central part of these houses divides the facade into 3 parts of equal length, while the height of the facade is also divided into 3 equal parts, as you can see here. The whole facade can be divided into a grid of 9 equal squares. Now, these houses were built by master carpenters. The details, as you can see, are derived from classical sources. And so is the use of proportion. Someone's been reading Palladio. Well, we now turn to the Baroque. In the house to the left, which was built by a royal court architect, the windows are equally spaced and vertically aligned. And please note, the plaster facade is of later date. So note the spacing of the windows and the form of the volume. In the house to the left, both the main volume and the large dormer on the roof reproduce the forms of a Greek temple, with columns regularly spaced and with a low gable on the dormer. And the proportion 3:2 is repeated in the relation of length to width and in the relation of width to height. The module in this house is 3 alen. Alen equals 2 foot, or 63 centimeters. So the module is 3 alen. The dimensions are all multiplications of 3. Ideally, this house should have been 18 alen wide. It's only 17, but it should have been 18. But minor imperfections are acceptable. As you'll see, the basic dimensions are 12, 18, 27, all multiplications of 3. And 18 is the geometric mean between 12 and 27. Now, the other house to the right, here the windows are grouped closely together, as suits the material. This is a wooden house. And therefore the Greek form is lost, but the classical detail remains. The portal and corner boards are fluted, like Ionic pilasters. The cornice has a cavetto molding and dentils, and the house is firmly proportioned. Height equals length, and the cornice divides the height of the house into 2 equal parts. Now, in a sense, this is the most classical solution you can imagine. The classical language of columns and arches expresses structural realities. And once these realities are no longer there, the structural use of this language is best avoided. An arch built of timber makes no sense. On the other hand, the classical ideals of proportion could easily be adapted in timber, and this was done from early on, as you can see from this illustration. And here's the early example. In this house, the oldest part, 1613, the wings, 1661. The way the wings are joined looks distinctly odd, but this aspect didn't matter. What mattered was the proportions of the rooms and of the courtyard. This is a Renaissance house. The garden was a separate entity on the field to the right, on the other side of a brook. There's no axiality here. The road went past the garden, over the bridge and into the courtyard. And just to assure you, Denmark at the same time was equally old-fashioned. You'll notice here the steep gables, the separate garden behind the fence to the left, and the access road past the garden and over the moat. And as in the previous example, the Cour d'honneur faces the farmyard. This is more modern. It's the grandest country house in the Bergen area and the only one built of stone. The Italian roof is an early sign of the Baroque, but otherwise it is still Renaissance. The courtyard is closed. The road is not on an axis with the house. The garden is a separate entity surrounded by walls. The house is not adorned with classical detail, but it is carefully proportioned. The garden is proportioned 4:3 with 12 squares, as you can see. The house too is proportioned 4:3. And in the facade, the proportion of the wings to the courtyard is 3:4:3. While the courtyard is exactly the size of a garden square. Inside, the ceiling height of the piano nobile is 6 alen. That's almost 4 meters. And everything is based on a module of 3 alen. The biggest room is 6 times 12 times 24. The second largest is 6 times 12 times 12, and so on. It's always multiplications of 3. Now, this is made to look neat in the office of the owner in Copenhagen. In reality, the garden is on a slightly oblique angle to the house, about 5 degrees. Now, why is that? It's to correct visually for the fact that the whole parterre is tilted towards the south and west, and to make it look symmetrical and correct and rectilinear from the second floor, it has to be slightly oblique on the ground. So this is what it looks like. And that kind of optical corrections were quite common in this period. Our next example is the suburban villa of Commander Cicignon. Cicignon was a military engineer. He had been in the service of Venice fighting the Turks and came to Norway in 1658. He's famous for planning the town of Trondheim 20 years later. Now, the 5-part rhythm of the facade is unmistakably Baroque. And both the access road and the garden behind the house are on an axis with the house. The garden is small, but it was on a hilltop, commanding a wide view over the fjord. So you have an axis running through the house and garden and into the landscape. This is a slightly more old-fashioned villa from the same time. The entrance was through a gate in the corner, in the corner down to the left of you. And the plan is seen from the same side as the facade of the house in the old photo. What's important here is that the house is part of the geometry of the garden. It's been integrated into one large square. The garden squares here are proportioned 3:2, measuring 16 to 24 Olin. If you see at the side facing the town, which is the side you can see here, and the side that's down on the drawing, the house was flanked by a fence on each side, and the proportions of fences to house was 2:3:2. The same proportion, 2:3:2, is repeated on the ground plan between the flanking rooms and the large rooms in the middle. And it was probably also articulated on the facade. So the proportion 2:3:2 runs through the entire house. This is Østrot. The castle is not a fortification, it's a symbolic castle. It's a castle, really a hunting lodge built in the 1650s, and it's typical of Northern Renaissance. It's picturesque, but it's also strictly proportioned. The pyramid was added 10 important years later as the centerpiece of a highly original Baroque landscape plan. So the pyramid, as you can see, is 7 to 8 meters. I've never acquired precise measurements of it. Now this is a reconstruction of the Baroque layout of the 1660s, and it's my own reconstruction. The details are uncertain, but we know there were 2 separate gardens, one on each side of the forecourt, and we know the roads did not converge in front of the castle. Instead, both the road from the harbour and the road from the hunting park pointed in straight line towards the pyramid, but the pyramid was fenced off inside a garden, and both roads broke off before they reached it. I've never seen anything like it, and I will be interested to hear if you have. Now, we'll just briefly look at this house. It's rather a joke. The most important thing about it is that it is not symmetrical at all. But you're supposed to enter it through the gate at the left, and from that point of view, the unsymmetrical facade will look symmetrical because of the oblique angle. And there's much more to it, which I hope to develop in my paper afterwards. Here too, everything is based on multiplications of, in this case, the number 13. And what we have here is a parterre, as you can see, and then what appears to have been a secret garden, a narrow secret garden to the right. Here's a more conventional garden of the same shape from the same time. As you can see, the road and forecourt have all been aligned with the same axis. Note the invisible pond at the far end of the garden. This pond is down a few steps from the garden parterre, and therefore invisible from the house. Now, where have you seen that before? Vaux-le-Vicomte. This is another case of conventional Baroque with the same invisible pond. This house is a rebuilding of a Baroque layout. A concave building links the main volume to a low colonnade on either side. And these colonnades are a screen to hide that the entrance court behind them is on a higher level than the garden. Now, where have you seen that before? Palladius Villa Barbaro. There's clever use of perspective here, and this photo shows what the human eye does not register. The colonnades are on different levels. This goes unnoticed because they can't easily be seen at the same time. They're also child-sized, but this only makes them look more distant. You only realize close up that they really are child-sized and not, what should I say, grown-up sized. Now, when we look at the contour lines of the map of this, well, this is the ground plan. When we look at the contour lines of the map, we find extensive landscaping. The house lies on an artificial terrace. Behind the house is a steep embankment with the remains of a double staircase leading to another narrow terrace. And then there's a fenced-off slope ending towards a cliff. And you see a brook. Apparently there's been some sort of water feature here. You'll also notice that the axis deviates slightly on the garden side. This is to align the axis on an island fortress in the fjord below. Now, this too is conventional Baroque. We have likely models for the layout and for the garden feature, for the water feature, I'm sorry. I'll finish with something which is not conventional. Now, in the late Renaissance, the garden was sometimes organized as a grid with a house in one corner. Here are two examples. And basically, such a layout is what we have here. This house once had 3 wings. You can see the road from the harbor in the foreground and the Cour d'Honneur in the middle. The 2 small houses are of later date. And my reconstruction to the left shows, on the far left, the wing that's still there. Then there were 2 more wings which have been lost. Today the houses are gone, but the foundations remain. Now take a good look at the plan, and I'll show you what it looks like today. On the right, we see a long, narrow terrace, about 50 meters long. This terrace on the right is tilted 3 degrees towards the house. And the whole garden is tilted 3 degrees towards the south, away from us. So what appears to be a flat garden, a horizontal garden, is not horizontal. It is slightly tilted. Now what's more, the foundations show that the wing of the house facing the garden was also tilted 3 degrees to make it parallel to the inclination of the garden. There are no right angles here and no horizontal planes, but there's clever use of inclinations to fool the eye. And I've never seen anything quite like this either. Basically, this garden is a grid with a house with 3 wings in one corner. But this whole grid has been jazzed up to quite a degree. You'll notice that the forecourt between the wings of the house is trapezoidal. Now, where have you seen a trapezoidal court before? Obviously, Michelangelo's Campidoglio. As I said, the entire garden is tilted 3 degrees towards the south, and the garden front was tilted in the same way, so that the tilting of the garden should go unnoticed. Now, where would you get such an idea? Tilting an entire facade to make it parallel to a sloping ground. Here, of course. Well, thank you.
Thank you, fascinating, and so many buildings I'd never seen before. Our next speaker is Anna Bortolozzi. She's professor of art history at Stockholm's Università, where she's worked since 2015. A specialist in Baroque architecture, her particular interests include architectural drawings and their materiality, the relationship between architecture and cultural identity, and the shape and use of sacred spaces during the Counter-Reformation. She's the author of the book Sant'Ambrogio and Carlo Alcorso, Identità, Magnificenza e Culto delle Reliquie nella Roma del primo Seicento of 2014, as well as articles on the completion of New St. Peter's under Paul V, the memory of the Old Basilica and the Vatican grottos. During her time as a research fellow at the Nationalmuseum in Stockholm, she published a catalogue of Italian architectural drawings from the Kronstadt collection, which I had a very formally and publicly then endorsed in a review with great pleasure. And her latest research focuses on semi-mechanical copying methods in architectural practice, particularly the use of transparent paper for copying and designing in the early modern period. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So we will continue with Tessin, and I'm very much grateful to my predecessors, so they have introduced to you the topic so thoroughly. In 1707, after completing his designs for the reconstruction of the Royal Palace in Stockholm, Nicodemus Tessin the Younger began to develop a grand plan for the area between the palace and Norrmalmstorg. The project included a monumental royal coronation and burial church flanked by twin palaces, grandiose royal stables, and a magnificent arsenal palace. In the catalogue of his drawings and prints, compiled in 1712, as you have been heard, Tessin lists 5 large-scale designs relating to a trophy palace planned for the city of Stockholm in one of the most adventurous locations in the world. These drawings can be identified as 5 large sheets currently held at the Riksarkivet, the War Archive in Stockholm, alongside a few other preliminary designs and sketches, as well as a memorandum addressed to King Charles XII. Across 10 pages, Tessin describes the new Stockholm arsenal as a Palais de la Gloire, a hall of fame, designed to celebrate the nation's military might and the martial virtues of Swedish kings from Gustav II Adolf to Charles XII. The arsenal was also intended to serve as a Troféhus, as a trophy house, showcasing the royal armory and the war booty and trophies looted by Charles XII's army during their victorious campaigns. This collection of over 1,300 pieces of armor and artillery, 4-masted ships, and over 3,000 flags and standards was moved around 1690 to the Macalös Palace, which was built in the 1630s by the German master mason Hans Jakob Christler for Count Jakob de la Gardie. Tessin claimed that such a treasure deserved a more fitting display and explained that the necessity of constructing a new arsenal building with 2 main arguments: the rather monstrous northern Renaissance style of the Maculus Palace, and its state of disrepair. An image of the royal armory from the second half of the 19th century, when the collection was kept at the royal palace, can be used to get an idea of the kind of objects that were gathered at Maculus Palace. Particular mention should be given to the exceptional collection of foreign banners, which are now preserved at the Army Museum in Stockholm. By around 1696, Nicodemus Tessin had already drawn up plans for a royal arsenal. This was a single-story long hall, completed at one end by a circular tribune. However, this building could not compete with the grand scale of the new Stockholm Palace or the other arsenal buildings being constructed in European cities at the time. From simple shelters for storing weapons, arsenals had become showplaces for booty taken from conquered enemies in military conflicts, further increasing the glory of victory. An example of such a building is the Berlin Zeughaus, which was built between 1695 and 1729 on Unter der Linde in front of Berlin Castle. Designed by Johann Arnold Nering, Martin Grünberg, Andreas Schluter, and Jean de Botte, the project was based on the east wing of the Louvre and formed part of the political propaganda of the Elector of Brandenburg, the future king Frederick I, to establish Prussia as a sovereign power. Tessin was well informed about the plans for the Berlin arsenal, having reported in his travel notes from 1688 that the cost was expected to be 100,000 Reichsthaler. In 1710, the German architect and mathematician Leonhard Christoph Sturm had published Das neu eröffnete Arsenal, the newly opened arsenal, a guide to European arsenal buildings, which he describes as a place where the gallant youth and other curious minds, but especially travelers, can marvel at the artillery and similar things. The Stockholm Arsenal is said to be as one of the richest in Europe in terms of the number and importance of its trophies, which are kept in a beautiful but unsuitable palace. Tessin's grandiose project for the new arsenal was intended to remedy this situation and put Sweden on a par with the other great European military powers. His drawings depict a monumental two-story palace with an attic resting on a rusticated base opened by arcades. A colossal order of Doric half-columns articulated the facade, creating a striking visual effect. Two large towers, crowned with elegant onion domes, stand at the corners of the building. Two lower wings extend perpendicularly from these towers, stretching towards the water basin and forming a large parade ground. In this royal square, statues of the four kings who made Sweden a great power, Gustav II Adolf, Charles X, Charles XI, and Charles XII, watch over the royal palace. The plans of the ground and first floors, as well as the section of the central block of the building, help us to understand how trophies and looted arms and armor were intended to be displayed. The pieces of artillery, and in particular cannons, were placed under the arcades of the ground floor. the first floor galleries showcased full suits of armor on stands and on horseback. In the attic, Islamic armor and weapons were hung on the walls. The most spectacular arrangement was, however, in the two towers, which opened up the height of the dome. In the middle of these were two tall conical structures, almost 27 meters high and 9.5 meters wide at the bottom, which Tessin calls cylinders. Each cylinder was surrounded by over 300 banners inserted along a spiral frieze. In his memorandum, Tessin explained that one can walk between these flags at the top of the cylinders and be seen by all, as the path to the top becomes both narrower and steeper, alluding to the difficulty one encounters the closer one gets to glory and immortality, of which a statue will sit on a round pedestal at the top of the cylinders. He continues, the parapet around the cylinders, behind which the staircase is located, is decorated with a series of war scenes and battles in gold on a rose-colored background, as well as festoons of laurels and all the antique painted trophies that serve as the lower support for the aforementioned cylinder. It should also be noted that in the middle of these cylinders there is a small round staircase leading all the way up. Tessin's 1707 project for the Stockholm Arsenal was largely based on his 1705 design for rebuilding the west wing of the Louvre, which was never executed, as Martin showed before. So in here you can see how similar the two fronts, so the front of the arsenal and one of the wing of this of the project are. In turn, this project depended on French and Roman prototypes that Tessin admired, the east wing of the Louvre, the Place Vendôme, the Palazzo Caprini, and Borghese. However, it is the interior furnishing and decoration on which I would like to focus my attention. As it is very well known, Tessin spent 2 extended periods on the continent, visiting Italy and Rome twice in the 1670s and 1680s. During his travels, he visited all the major art and antiquities collections, as well as those of arms and armor. One such collection was that of the Palazzo Carrara in Bologna, which he visited in 1688. The palace owner was the brother of Enea Silvio Caprara, a general in the German Imperial Army who fought against the Turks and participated in the defense of Vienna in 1681. Tessin was particularly impressed by one rustic chamber in the palace, which featured Turkish rarities hanging on one wall, arranged in a very tasteful manner. The sketch of this hanging later became the model for the compelling display in the attic of the Arsenal Palace in Stockholm. Tessin's design might also have been informed by another famous collection of Ottoman war trophies that he visited in Bologna, that of Ferdinando Cospi. However, it was his experience of ancient and modern Rome and his memory of it through prints that provided Tessin with the powerful visual rhetoric suited to his visionary project for the Arsenal Palace in Stockholm. In particular, he looked at monuments closely associated with Roman warfare and military triumph, such as the columns of Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, with their spiral friezes depicting military campaigns, the Metasudans, the Vatican obelisk, and the arches of Septimius Severus and Marcus Aurelius. Marcello Fagiolo has eloquently explained how these monuments nourished the imagination of Carlo Fontana and of his pupil, Fischer von Erlach. Similarly, Nicodemus Tessin the Younger, another young foreign architect who frequented Fontana's studios, was attracted to the same models. There is no doubt that the two spectacular flag-bearing cylinders placed in the corner towers of the Arsenal Palace were inspired by ancient cocklight columns. Tessin knew these monuments well and kept accurate depictions and representations in his library, including the complete survey of the Antonine column that Pietro Santibartoli published in 1675. Building on this model, the frieze decorating the parapet of the external circular staircase presented the victorious military campaigns of the Swedish kings. However, due to its performative nature, one can walk between these flags at the top of the cylinders and be seen by all. Tessin's invention was both classical and Baroque. The conic shape, inspired by Roman mete, was used in 1705 by Carlo Fontana in the catafalque for the funeral service of Emperor Leopold I in Santa Maria dell'Anima. In 1712, Fontana's catafalque became the model for that of another emperor, Joseph I, designed by Fernando Poletti for the same church. The association between the mete with spiral frieze and the imperial insignia eventually established a successful iconography with which Tessin might have been familiar through prints. Helmut Hager suggests that Fontana might have based his design for Leopold I on the decorative scheme supplied by his pupil Sebastiano Cipriani for the catafalque of James II of England, whose funeral service took place in San Lorenzo in Lucina in 1702. A set of engravings by Alessandro Specchi depicting James II's funeral service appears in the 1712 catalogue of Tessin's vast collections of books, drawings, and prints. The catalogue also contains individual prints documenting the splendid commemorations of military commanders who died at Candia, which were orchestrated by Bernini in Roman churches in 1669. The catafalque erected for François Guillaume de Ville in Santa Maria Maggiore, and that for the Duke of Beaufort in Santa Maria d'Araceli. The pyramid that characterizes the latter design was likely the model for the monument to Gustavus II Adolf, which in the Arsenal project creates a spectacular screen between the gallery at the first floor and one of the corner towers. It took 5 years for Tessin's drawings and memorandum to reach King Charles II at his tent at Bender, where he had been living as a guest of the Ottoman Sultan since the disaster of the Battle of Poltava. The proposal to build a new monumental palace to house war booty and trophies greatly pleased and thrilled the king. He would have started construction immediately he said, if there had been any money. Thank you.
Thank you. It's always a question of money, it seems. Imagine what Stockholm might look like, and Copenhagen, and Rome even. Our next speaker is Otto Ruin, who's a PhD student at Stockholm's University, working on a dissertation on Hubert Robert and temporality. He's also curated an exhibition in collaboration with the Nationalmuseum on Louis-Jean Desprez at the Swedish Institute in Paris. And it's, I imagine, a version of that, or an offshoot of that we're going to hear about now, with scenes of Nordic Arcadia and Desprez Scenography in Sweden.
Thank you. I just shortly before told you about my CV. So my MA was about Hubert Robert, so the PhD is also about Louis-Jean Desprez. But I also want to once again say bravo to the program. Speaking of models of circulation, since the Arsenal that Anna Bortolozzi talked about later became a theater where Desprez debuted. So a great example of circulation of models. Desprez has been hovering around in this conference. I'm very glad to see this Roman interest of Desprez, and I think to understand this artist, you need to look at him as a Roman artist. But so for this paper, I will examine, and this, of course, will be a sketch of my PhD project, I want to say as well, so it's really the start. This paper examines two case studies from the rich and multifaceted Louis-Jean Desprez, an artist whose practice encompasses architecture, stage designs, painting, and printmaking, focusing on one stage design and one architectural project from ancient and modern Uppsala. I want to show how both works reveal a process of artistic transformation from Rome to Sweden during a period of political and cultural change. Through these examples, I further argue that the intermediate relationship between built architecture and imagined architectural scenery constitutes a central artistic strategy in Desprez's work, and that his craftsmanship can only be fully understood when these media are studied in relation to another. And so on, let's go to the theater. A temple with strange pastel-like columns emerged from a cave in a Nordic forest. Two Egyptian Catalan lions flank the entrance. Esoteric runestone stands in the foreground. And to the left, a sunflower rise, suggesting a southern latitude. The scene evokes an eclectic landscape of elements that simply do not belong together. We appear to be in Arcadian North, but where exactly? The scene in question is the opening from Frigga, a one-act comic opera written by King Gustav III, which premiered at the Royal Opera House in Stockholm in 1787. The drama is a love story between Prince Yngve, the man-born son of Odin, and Frigga, the goddess of the Norse pantheon, whom Yngve one day finds sleeping outside her temple. The site is ancient Uppsala, the center of prehistoric Sweden, and, according to the myth, founded by Yngve. The visual imagination behind this scene belongs to the French artist and architect Louis-Jean Desprez that we've already met. Born in Auxerre in 1743, Desprez studied at the Royal Academy of Architecture in Paris under Jacques-François Blondel, absorbing the monumental, theoretical neoclassicism of the 1760s. In 1776, after 6 attempts, and already considered somewhat old, Desprez finally won Prix de Rome as an architect. Soon after arriving at the Palazzo Mazzini, he was recruited to illustrate Abbé de Saint-Nan's monumental Voyage Pittoresque of the Kingdom of Sicily and Naples. This assignment led him to an extensive journey through southern Italy, where he practiced his skills in landscape drawing and architectural documentation. He sketched ruins, costumes, religious ceremonies, and large-scale illuminations. For a trained neoclassicist as Desprez, a new architectural language opened up, seemingly without any rules. An eclectic mix of Gothic arches, Roman and Greek temples, and the macabre. When Desprez returned to Rome nearly 2 years later, he did so as a peintre architect, working in the genre of Capriccio and architectural fantasy associated with Giovanni Battista Piranesi, Panini, Hubert Robert, and as we heard yesterday, Filippo Juvara, known for their imaginative visions of modern and ancient Rome. These artists presented the city's topography as an assemblage of ruins and temporal ruptures, thus encouraging new reflections on historical time. This genre was synonymous with Rome, and not at least deeply rooted within the French Academy. While working in the spirits of these artists, they coupled this style with sublime visions of the underworld and Gothic architecture, a pictorial cosmos that, as it happened, was ideal for the theatre. Around 1780, he was employed as a stage designer at Teatro Liberti, one of Rome's most prominent theatres. Desprez's talent, as we already heard from earlier speakers, caught King Gustav III's attention during the monarch's Italian journey. Desprez was hired for a 2-year contract as decorator for the Royal Theatre and Opera in Stockholm in 1784. The Swedish theatre thrived during Gustav III, nourished by rising national sentiment. For Gustav III, known as a theatre king, theatre was more about political strategy than entertainment. It was, to use an anachronistic term, a question of identity politics. Through the stage, Gustav III shaped chauvinistic national character rooted in heroic Swedish ancestry, and Desprez was to become the creative visual driving force behind this project. Without going into much details in the two historical dramas of Queen Kristina from 1785 and the opera Gustav Vasa from 1786, Desprez painted a Gothic grand past of Sweden, which we now know from Kristoffer paper is a complicated history. However, for those aware of Swedish architectural history, knows that these sovereigns' visions have little to do with reality. And here we see the garden of the Palace Makalösen. In the back, you see to your left the tower of Frikroners, and in the back a mountainscape that has nothing to do, of course, with Sweden, but something else. Desprez knew probably nothing about Swedish history when I arrived in Stockholm in 1784. But as the Swedish art historian Per Bjurström has remarked, Desprez had the possibility to study some of the historical sites, prints. Likewise, he could have used Erik Dahlberg's Svesa as a model for the castle of Tre Kronor. But instead, to portray the ancient North, he took inspiration from what he knew best, Sicilian Gothic and Roman festivities. Desprez's visionary dramas of Swedish Gothic history were grand, expensive, and successful for Gustav III. Gustav Vasa became the most popular opera and the national epic of the Gustavian era. The interest in national myth-making and Gothic romanticism was on the rise during the last decades of the 18th century, but there was no iconographic consensus yet on how to depict the Swedish past. Desprez, a Roman peintre architect who mastered Gothic architecture, was the ideal artist to visualize Swedish history. In its eclectic style, the stage designs highlight a cultural transformation from a Roman and Southern Gothic to a dynamic Swedish cultural and political context. When this, it brings back to the comedy Frigga. In comparison to the two historical plays about Queen Kristina and Gustav Vasa, both situated in a Gothic fantasy past, Desprez collected inspiration from Arcadian sceneries when Norse mythology was put on stage. The instructions for the opening scenes in the libretto are sweeping for interpretation. I quote, "The theatre depicts the sacred grove surrounding the temple of Frigga in ancient Uppsala. The temple can be seen in the background, almost hidden by trees." The artist created 3 versions of the backcloth of Frigga. One in 1785 for Gripsholms Theatre, you see here, one for the Royal Opera 2 years later, and finally one in 1792 for the theatre at Drottningholm. In the subsequent stage designs, there's a clear development of the Nordic style. The first version has some resemblance to a Nordic climate. We can see pine trees and a forest lake in the background. The presumed viewer stands in a cave-like formation, which Desprez had been using since drawing the case of Polignano in Bari. To the left stands a Corinthian-esque temple with Bernard Fouquet's lion from the royal palace. With its anachronistic detail of ancient and the modern, Desprez created a line from Norse mythology to the modern king. not unlike the Roman sovereign lineage from gods to emperors. In the second version mentioned in the beginning of this paper, the temple itself has moved into a cave in an archaic structure. The Fouquet lion has become Egyptian lions, emphasizing the origin of architecture. According to the Swedish art historian Bo Wallner, the esoteric runestone sunflowers and Egyptian monument could emphasize Masonic Neoplatic ideals. But without any proof, I think one can stay with underlying the piece's visual experimentation, searching for cross-cultural Arcadian North, and that the second stage design is more inspiring. But then finally, in the last version, known only today from student copies, the scene has developed even further into archaic scenery. The temple structure has become the grotto itself, with a coffered apse, with two reindeers on each side. Flanking now with these two reindeers that actually still exists in the Drottningholm Theatre, together with one of the original set-piece runestones. The runestone is of particular interest. Scholars have identified the runestone from Johan Peringskäll Monumenta Urakensia, and not only, the runestone came suitable from the areas around Uppsala. Hence, we can observe a iconographical development of the Prea's part, from reusing symbols and forms from his Roman period to integrate runestone as a decorative element to developing an antiquarian iconography to historical city, the play. Today, Frigga is regarded as Gustav I's least successful play. On its premiere preview at Gripsholm in 1785, the king's niece Hedvig Elisabeth Charlotta wrote cynically in his famous diary, "The king had written a play reminiscent of those performed by children. It was naturally considered excellent because it was written by a king. Had it been written by someone else, it would have been regarded as highly mediocre." Despite its poor reception, it was later described in press as truly Swedish theatre. Frigga was the first effort to put Norse mythology on stage with a Swedish libretto and a Swedish composer, Olof Ålström. In this way, it was the natural mythological development of the historical plays about sovereigns as Queen Kristina and Gustav Vasa. And for the king, theatre was a question of staging the great past through allegories of song, text, not at least symbolic architecture. Frigga is the prime example of the eclectic and sometimes bizarre opera of the Gustavian era. And now let's turn to architecture. Desprez studied architecture for his stage designs, but likewise he used the stage to test architectural projects. At the Art Academy in Stockholm, we find architectural drawings on the Frigga temple. There's also a copy of this in Uppsala, dated 1788, from the same portfolio as Charlotta showed us yesterday. We do not know the purpose of it, but it was probably a temple for English garden. It emphasized the idea of architecture's picturesque scenery, more for the pleasure of the eye than function. And most of the Desprez's grand vision remained on paper, according to the traditional utopian architecture of late 18th century, or ironically, as ruins, as in the case with the Haga Palace, as we saw yesterday. Yet it highlights the dual role of the Desprez theatre productions. On the one hand, they illustrate the artist's impression from Rome and Italy. On the other hand, he uses the stage to develop architectural forms that he later presents for a circle of noble clients' interest in these visionary projects. And just to mention another example, with the Desprez's fascination with the Egyptian pyramid, we can also see this strategy. Here, the pyramid serves both as a backdrop to stage designs of Electra and as proposal for Swedish Pantheon in this case. The year after Frigga premiere, Desprez was given the opportunity to design a real temple in Uppsala. The king donated land to the city to create a botanical garden and a temple in honor of the famous Carl Linnaeus. This temple of science would display a naturalia collection, living animals, an orangery, and a lecture hall. However, the king was not satisfied with the drawings of the chief architect Olof Tempelman and instead contracted Desprez. The foundation had been laid, but Desprez was still able to redesign the interiors and facade based on Tempelman's original proposal. If we compare the two projects, we can recognize Desprez's characteristic pastel-inspired columns from Frigga, distinguished by their strange capitals. He also altered the rhythm of the colonnade, producing a non-classical intercolumnation. The rustication was removed, as were the windows' adequates, resulting in a more restrained and monumental expression. The prominent gutta further accentuate the pediment in the Priest's proposal. But the most significant symbolic alteration in the facade, however, appears in the niches, where Tempelman placed sculptures of Apollon and Minerva, appropriate for a temple of science. Desprez replaced them with two Egyptian figures, perhaps alluding to his Masonic interest or more likely to the Egyptomania found in Roman sites such as Pernesis Café degli Inglesi. Walking around to the north facade, Desprez created two, in the words of the art historian Oscar Reuterswärd, sunken arches that resonates with antique arches hidden and yet to be discovered beneath the soil, which were closely studied by the neoclassical architects in the late 18th century. The monumental structure of the north facade has been suggested to be inspired by Claude Nicolas Ledoux' Hôtel Télusson from 1778. Desprez could have been inspired by Ledoux, but that would overlook how the sunken arches and vaults was already part of his oeuvre in printmaking and scenography. I think it's more plausible to think of it as an intermediate case of architecture and scenography than as a reference to his fellow French colleague. And now, entering the hall. Tempelman had planned an auditorium for lectures where the orator would stand in front of a bust of Linnaeus. The windows on each side would let in daylight. Desprez removed the windows for lunettes and added an oculus in the center for top light. He also added a lantern above the now-seated sculpture of Linnaeus in a more emperor manner. We can also notice the reliefs with text and shelves with botanical plants in Desprez's suggestion, recalling the typology of bust and stone slabs in Roman museums such as the Capitoline. The light from the lantern plays beautifully across the coffer apse, evoking the Pantheon, suitable to the Linnaeus temple. Through the vault, the gaze is drawn upwards. The painted ceiling, with its blue-gray tones characteristic of the Gustavian era, becomes a serene sky, where the Nordic daylight finds its way in through the oculus. The result was one of the most remarkable neoclassical buildings in Sweden. As earlier scholar has noticed, Desprez changed only details to Tempelman's project, but with great effect. The temple, dedicated to natural science and the greatest man of the Swedish Enlightenment, became a building without strict architectural rules or actually practical function. In the drawings, it combined naturalia with Egyptomania, sepulchral arches, sublime lighting, and Desprez's homemade pestum order. It was as much theatre as architecture. And to conclude, Desprez's strategies as an architect were those of a scenographer. The stage became the place where Desprez dwelled between fantasy, style, and monumental structures, which he later often presented as architectural projects and vice versa. It is an architecture of sceneries, of strong emotions, and of historical layers. Desprez came to Sweden at a time of great change and rising naturalism. He would have been one of the last great foreign artists to be contracted in Sweden. Through Gustav III's theatrical patriotism, Desprez transferred the Roman capriccio into a montage of Swedish history and myth, which had not yet found its own iconography. So here is a first case study sketch then for the forthcoming year. So hopefully I will during this PhD be able to present further proof on this intertwined complex strategies of Desprez's architecture sonography. And just ending with an epilogue, Desprez passed away in 1804 and never saw the completion of the Botanicum, which was finished 3 years later. The audience hall was never used for its original purpose. It was too impractical. In the German Swede Ernst Moritz Arndt's travelogue from Sweden from 1807, he described the auditorium of the Botanicum in Uppsala as, "It is visibly narrow and disproportionate, which is why it's not pleasing to the eye." At the beginning of the new century, the grandeur of Desprez's architecture had fallen out of fashion as rational thought gained influence. But yet, by a twist of fate, the impractical hall became a musical space during the late 19th century. Copies of the Swedish romantic sculptor Bengt Erland Fogelberg, Norse sculpted to det Nationalmuseum, were installed in the auditorium. These monumental sculptures, commissioned by Charles Forte John, became the model for Swedish North iconography during the 19th century. Hence, the circle was complete. the Nordic Arcadia of mythological Uppsala, which Desprez had staged a century earlier in the comedy Frigga, was at last realized in the modern city. In the artist pantheon, Odin and the Norse gods reigned while nature flourished outside in a botanical garden. Thank you.
Fratin, Pichetto.
Thank you. Once again, fascinating. Our next speaker is Anna Pichetto Fratin, who holds a PhD in architectural history and is currently working at the Direzione regionale Musei di Piemonte. She's a member of the research team for the project Rome and the Nordic countries, us, that is, where, building on her doctoral work, she investigates the dissemination of the classical idiom in Sweden and Finland between the late 18th and early 19th centuries, with particular attention to the pivotal figures of Kristoffer Neville and Carlo Bassi, we'll hear about now.
Last year, at the Nordic Rome conference, organized within the framework of this research project, I focused on the life and work of the Italo-Swedish architect Carlo Bassi, only briefly touching upon the work of one of his closest friends. The education and careers of Carlo Bassi and Carl Christoph Gjort unfolded along almost parallel trajectories. Bassi, who would later become superintendent of public works in Finland, and Gjort, appointed city architect of Stockholm, shared a formative path that left evident traces in their architectural production. Gjort, the son of a bookseller who owned a small publishing house and served for several years as librarian for a royal book collection of Stockholm's royal palace, was expected to follow in his father's footsteps. Bassi, orphaned as a child, arrived in Sweden accompanying his sister, a dancer. Both were enrolled between 1784 and 1788 in the newly founded course of civil architecture in the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Stockholm, established only a few years earlier in 1779. In 2017, the Nationalmuseum in Stockholm acquired at auction a collection of documents, drawings, and sketchbooks belonging to Carl Christoph Gjort, preserved by the descendants of his daughter Elizabeth. The most substantial part of the collection is a group of documents relating to the architect's study trip in Italy between 1794 and 1796. These are complemented by several drawings from his students' years, a sketchbook from his time in the studio of Desprez, a number of capriccious and decorative motifs in the interior furnishing, and a few sheets dating from his activity as a city architect in Stockholm. Most of the drawings were digitalized in 2019, yet the corpus remained largely unpublished. It therefore offers broad opportunities to reassess one of the most active, yes, forgotten, figures of the Swedish neoclassical architecture. Gjort and Bassi were trained in the 1780s at the height of Gustav III's influence on the art. At the Kunstakademien, they studied practical geometry, perspective, and structural calculation under Olof Tempelman and Erik Palmens, both renowned for their pure classicism. Each year, the Academy organized a prize competition in architectural drawing. In 1786, both received a medal for the design of a hospital, and Gjort was awarded prizes also in the following 2 years. His surviving student sketchbooks in Stockholm reveal a succession of drawings and studies, elevation sections, and plans that recall the architecture of Ledoux and Boulez, or closer to home, those of Desprez, for whom both architects worked immediately after completing their studies. They were introduced to Desprez by Adolf Friedrich Munk, a member of the royal court, friend of Gustav III, and lover of Giovanna Bassi, Carlo's sisters. Hired in 1788, the two young architects produced copies, working drawings, and final presentation plates. Gjert will also serve as an interlocutor between the king and Desprez, who seldom visited the construction site, and was the architect of several projects for pavilions in the vast park of Hoga. Surviving images shows, among others, the well-known Eco Temple and the Chinese Pavilion. In 1792, Gustav III died and the plans for Hoga were interrupted. Lacking commission, Carlo Bassi immediately left Sweden for an extended trip to Italy. According to a letter by Gustav Ostillen, he arrived in Rome on 20 July 1791, remained there until the proclamation of the Roman Republic, and was joined by Gjert in 1794, who stayed until 1796. Packing the Voyage en Italie by Jérôme Lalande in the Yverdon edition of 1789 and a copy of Rousseau's Confessions, Gjert set sail from Stockholm on 25 April 1794 aboard the frigate Gripen, bound for Algiers. He reached Tunisia on 27 June, a barbarous and plague-ridden country, as he would write to his father. In Algiers, which, quote, presents itself as an amphitheater, he remained for 19 days. There, he measured the recently built Moorish-style house of the Spanish consul. These drawings would later be published by Sacro d'Agincourt and by Joseph-Jacques Ramet. After his North African interlude, the journey continued to the port of Livorno, where the passenger was held in quarantine. The plan was to proceed by sea to Civitavecchia, but due to the low tide, they continued by land with a hired carriage called Vetturino, passing through Florence, Siena, Bolsena, and Viterbo. On 23 October 1794, after 6 months' journey, Gjert arrived in Rome, initially lodging with Carlo Bassi in Via Orsoline. Bassi had previously lived in Via Piacenza with the French painter Denis Gagnero, who they would meet again in Florence. The arrival is described in a letter of 25 October 1794. My old friend Bassi also arrived. I was glad to be able to speak Swedish again. Bassi told me of a quarter where many artists lived and where he and Åkerström lived on the same street, also close to the places I need to study. The purpose of the journey was also, as he wrote, to study art and perfect myself in the science of architecture, to acquire finer taste and greater skills. His daughter Elizabeth later transcribed the letters to his family, preserving them in a 350-page volume now kept at the Kungliga Biblioteket. Reading this sort of familial diary reveals his melancholy and homesickness, as well as news from family matters and personal concerns. He wrote little about the voyage itself, and architectural reflection are spare, yet the letters nonetheless allow us to reconstruct impressions and places. Severe architectural judgments are extremely rare, perhaps simply omitted. His harshest remark concerns castle scenes in Austria, which he called obscenely German. When he does express criticism, he often paraphrases Lalande, for instance, remarking that Banvittel is built with, quote, poor harmony and no connection with the rest. He appreciated not only architecture but painting as well. His letter described Raffaello's Transfiguration and works by Guido Reni, Domenichino, and Tiziano, Rubens and Rembrandt in Palazzo Pitti, the Musei Capitolini, the Museo Pio Clementino, the Raffaello rooms, and Caravaggio's paintings in the lodges. Equally interesting is what the letters leave unsaid. Despite the turbulent period, Gjert shows little interest in politics, and he is always cautious in what he reports. His fathers eagerly sought news, but the architect remained prudent. Among the few political observations is a description of Napoleon's troop entering Bologna, welcomed without resistance because, quote, something new pleased many, and the alluring word liberty, with a capital letter, seemed familiar to everyone's mind. Despite his decision, He never mentioned Borromini or Bernini in his letter, although he drew several of their drawings, such as the Santa Maria Assunta in Ariccia. Gjert and Bassi lived in Rome during the years when, to quote Susanna Pasquali in Contro il Barocco, architects invented that specific Rome which enabled them all to abandon the Baroque and construct the new neoclassical language, reinterpreting Greek and Roman architecture according to the principle formulated by Milizia. The artistic community in the Urbe offered the Swedish architect an open-air laboratory in which to refine proportion, orders, and composition. From his letter, we learn how deeply he was impressed by St. Peter's and by Villa Farnesina, one of the most beautiful buildings in Rome, as he would write. He admired Palazzo Ruspoli, which, quote, the staircase so often praised for its beauty, found Martino Longhi not as extraordinary as he has been told, and at Palazzo Colonna he marveled at the most beautiful hall I had ever seen, bright and splendidly decorated. With Bassi, he visited the Hospital of Santo Spirito, which opened a series of inspections of similar institutions, clearly of great interest for both architects. Rome, however, was only the first stage in a long educational itinerary. In May, Gjert visited Albano, then Ariccia with the aforementioned Church of Santa Maria Assunta, Palestrina, and Tivoli. A second journey with Carlo Bassi is described in the letter of 5 September 1795. In July, they visited Viterbo, Montefiascone, and Bolsena. They continued to Siena and Florence, where they stayed for 2 months and also met Lars Grendel, who had fled Rome after being imprisoned in Castel Sant'Angelo, in order to enjoy, quote, complete freedom to express sentiments and thoughts in words, which had been risky and almost impossible where every other person is a priest or a spy. Then Livorno, where once again they visited the hospital. Finally, Genova, where they were struck by the palace of, quote, extraordinary magnificence and grandeur. It is no coincidence that Gjert's library would later include Martin Pierre Gauthier volume on Genoese palaces. They returned to Rome in December after almost 6 months of travel. In 1796, Gjert began planning his return journey, carrying on great regret, not having seen Naples, Herculaneum, and Pompeii. He had hoped to visit them in the summer of 1795, writing, "May God allow me to go there, for the return home without seeing the glories that are found there would make me desperate." But despite numerous requests, he was never granted a passport. He initially planned to travel via France in order to visit Paris, having heard from travelers that, quote, one cannot pass through any city without seeing beautiful things, and that in Paris architecture is of such interest that even what has been destroyed will be restored to the same level, if not greater. His parents, however, were deeply concerned about the political situation and the advance of Napoleon's army, and persuaded him to redirect his route through Germany. After purchasing Ottavio Bertotti Scamozzi publications, he made a deliberate stop in Vicenza to study Palladio's work. He visited Palazzo Chiricati, found the basilica, quote, superb, but was disappointed by the Teatro Olimpico. The return journey also included the following stops: Ancona, Bologna, Venice, Padova, and Trieste. He was not excessively harsh towards Gothic architecture. He was impressed by the Doge's Palace in Venice and by the Cathedral of San Marco, quote, a superb Gothic style with many mosaics and ornaments above the main portals. He described Venice as divine Venice, a place of which I shall never speak well enough. In early July, he crossed into Austria, continuing to Vienna, then Prague, Dresden, Berlin, Hamburg, Lübeck, and then Copenhagen. He admired Berlin as, quote, one of the most beautiful capitals I have ever seen, with long, wide, straight streets lined with houses and palaces, large square and splendid promenades. He praised the Cathedral of Prague, which, quote, has something cheerful in its interior, rare in the Gothic churches, just as the entire city has something cheerful in its appearance and reminds of Genoa. Nevertheless, he preferred the Cathedral of Florence, Siena, and Pisa to St. Stephen's in Vienna or Marienkirchen in Lübeck. In Hamburg, where he was forced to stay due to the illness of his traveling companion Henry Noe, he met Joseph Jacques Ramet. They spent much time drawing together, developing what Gjert would call the Algerian project, later appreciated by Socrates d'Agincourt, or partly published in 1811 in a plate based on drawing by M. Jouvel, he misspelled the name, young Swedish architect. On 4 November 1796, he was back in Stockholm. At the turn of the century, Passy was in Paris, where he purchased Percier and Fontaine Palais de Rome and wrote to Thorvaldsen requesting drawings and a quick answer to be sent in Hamburg, evidently on his way back to Stockholm too. In the summer of 1798, his return was noted by Carl Friedrich Friedenheim in his diary, quote, "It must have been a painful reminder of the past for Desprez. Full of joy, the young Passy arrived from the vast world that had once been his. He came to meet life and meet the many alluring commissions that awaited him, and he, the master, found himself relegated to the shadow as if he was now useless." Gjert, by contrast, was appointed on 13 July 1803 by order of the Governor-General Gustav Martin Armfeld as assistant in the office of the city architect, where he carried out topographic surveys and inspections. While Passy was engaged in the project for Aske Manor, Gjert worked on the private palace of the wealthy brewer Abraham Westman. They soon found themselves working side by side on the project for the Oboe Academy in Turku, an ambitious complex intended to become the finest academic Istanbul in the Nordic countries. The project was to include lecture halls, a library, a consistorial hall, and a grand ceremonial hall. Overloaded with the commitments in Stockholm, Gjert appointed Passy as construction supervisor. Passy moved to Finland in 1802, when the foundation works were already underway. On 24 July, at the cornerstone laying ceremony, Gjert received a silver hammer and trowel, the latter of both symbolically and physically handed to his colleague and friend. From the atrium, one entered directly into the ceremonial hall, the most spectacular space in the entire complex. The hall was conceived as a basilica, with paired Ionic columns supporting a richly stuccoed barrel vault. The central nave ended in an apse raised a few steps above the main floor. Light entered exclusively from the semicircular windows set into the vault. The decoration, extremely discussed by Ursula Sjoberg in her 1994 monograph on Gjert, appears to echo interiors from the Tuileries and the Louvre, included among the 11 drawings set between 1809 and 1812 by Percier and Fontaine to Alexander I, who had commissioned the architects to keep him updated on French imperial architecture. Yet at Oboe, the decoration was stripped of the animal and figural motifs of the more intricate elements present in the French models. The Great Fire of Turku in 1827 devastated the entire building, causing such severe damage that parts were demolished barely a decade after its inauguration. The present appearance, especially in the facade, shows clear alteration compared to the original designs. The third story, originally with windows opening only onto the courtyards, now has windows on the external facade as well, altering the proportions. The success of the Åbo Academy secured the reputation of both architects. Bassi in Finland as supervisor of public works of the newly autonomous Grand Duchy, and Gjert as a city architect of Stockholm. From this point on, they produced numerous state commissions, one for Russia, the other for Sweden, showing remarkable typological and stylistic affinities, liturgical furnishing, public and private buildings, prisons, schools, bridges, bell towers. Their projects share an essential classicism, attentive to function and economy of means. Bassi would complain throughout his life in letters to his friends about the chronic financial scarcity of his office. In this respect, Gjert was certainly more fortunate. No, ne manca una. There's supposed to be one slide more. This one. Both architects, although to different degrees, embraced the guidelines set out in the introduction to Palais Maison and Autres édifices modernes by Percier and Fontaine, where the authors openly encourage architects to use the volume as a design research. Quote, Italian architecture, for its ability to achieve elevated results with simple means, is well suited to be imitated. Unquote. The diffusion of the classical language in Sweden and Finland in the 18th and 19th century was not a phenomenon of passive importation, but of creative appropriation. Italian model serves not primarily as a direct ornamental templates, but as part of a cultural and material toolkit, prints, publication, drawing, sketchbooks, that architects training and connecting with Italy brought back to Scandinavian. They did not attempt to reproduce monumental Italian buildings. Instead, they extract elements of forms, order, and proportion, the relationship between facade and height and width, rather than rich decoration. Direct knowledge of antiquity and immersion in Rome's cosmopolitan milieu shaped an international neoclassical architectural language adapted to the local context of Sweden and Finland, producing monumentality by means of simplicity. Thank you.
And then there was one. Sofia Nannini is an assistant professor in architectural history at the Politecnico di Torino. She's author of Icelandic Farmhouses, Identity, Landscape, and Construction, 1790 to 1945, from 2023. And a year later, the Icelandic Concrete Saga, Architecture and Construction. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So thank you for the kind introduction, and thanks for having me here in this beautiful conference. I think it's fair to say that my presence here is the fault of Mario Bevilacquas, as he insisted that I looked for classical elements all the way up north to Iceland. And I also have to say that I'm mostly an architectural historian of the 19th and the 20th century, and basically for me history begins in 1824 when industrial cement was invented. So bear with me, I tried to meet up the expectations of the organizers, and I listened with a lot of curiosity to the talks of the previous days. So let me start by stating the obvious, that Reykjavik is 3,000 kilometers away from Rome. So the question is, has Rome traveled that far? So the insurmountable distance between the Italian peninsula and Iceland is perhaps also maybe the reason why I am the last speaker of this conference. These past days, we have learned that Rome was indeed alive in the Nordic countries, breathing through a multifaceted series of prints, books, and traveling architects. And the distance between Rome and Reykjavik, which is a distance made of land and sea and cultures, is perhaps also the reason why we are left with very few traces of the classical tradition. in Iceland. And in this presentation, I will focus on these counter-traces in the architectural tradition of the country between the 18th and the 20th centuries. And I hope I'll be convincing enough when I say, as you can read here, that Rome in Iceland was a matter of ghosts and books. So first of all, what was Iceland in the 18th century? As Icelandic historian Gunnar Karlsson writes in his History of Iceland, this was a time of contrasts. The island was first and foremost part of the Danish Empire, as it had been since the Kalmar Union in the late 14th century. It was governed by a trade monopoly that restricted all trade to Danish citizens based in Copenhagen. And Danish absolutism, which we saw in construction yesterday, ruled through a social class of Danish officials and also wealthy Icelandic landowners. This was also a time of increased geographical and geological explorations in the country, which led to discoveries such as pozzolana deposits throughout the 18th century, and most importantly of Iceland's spar, a crystal that became pivotal for the studies of optics in the 17th century. Over the 18th century, we also see the establishment of several trading centers, especially relying on stockfish, among which was the future city of Reykjavik, officially founded in 1786. And it's also important to remind that this was a very small social community with only up to 50,000 inhabitants at the beginning of the 18th century. At the same time, this was an era of disasters, such as the smallpox epidemics, which killed a quarter of the population at the beginning of the 18th century, as well as the terrible volcanic eruption of Laki, which caused a massive famine and was taken as an inspiration by Giacomo Leopardi for his operette morali. Since the settlement in the 9th century, Icelandic building traditions had revolved around the material scarcity of the country and the only building materials that were available, such as turf, gravel, and driftwood. Forests were scarce, and there were not enough clay resources for brick production. Furthermore, stone masonry was also limited because of the harshness of the local volcanic rocks. And so the most common building typology was the gabled farm, which you see here, with front timber gables and turf walls, and chambers connecting all living spaces for humans and livestock. Turf houses were slowly banned from urban settlements throughout the 19th century, although many inhabitants were still living in those farms until the years after the Second World War. With its seemingly natural and vernacular character, as an architecture that mostly stems from the ground, the turf farm seems to be the far opposite of the classical and theoretically grounded architecture of Rome. And yet, in 1539, we see an attempt at the Romanization of the turf dwellings, as described by Olaus Magnus in his Carta Marina, describing the turf farm as a cryptoporticus. But it's also fair to say that he also envisioned several tents in the country, as if Icelanders lived as nomads. But I'll come back to the turf houses later. The Danish imperial power onto Iceland was more of an economic and scientific one rather than an infrastructural force. Nevertheless, throughout the last decades of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century, this power was made tangible through the construction of several governmental and religious stone buildings commissioned by Danish authorities. These buildings, that are approximately 10 governmental buildings and 5 churches, were all built in stone, so creating a sort of a visual and material divide between the residence of the imperial officials and the local population. So here come the ghosts. These buildings were all designed by Danish architects, who often had prominent positions as court architects and art academy teachers in Denmark, and yet who never visited the island. Somehow these buildings are difficult to label. They are located in Iceland, but they are of Danish design and origins, also a symbol of colonial power. Their foreignness is marked by an historiographical fact, as they were first studied by Danish scholars, and the book you see here, Stenhuset i Gamle Islandi, it's the Icelandic translation of a book that first came out in Danish in 1977, the first book ever to explore the stone buildings of the Danish tradition in the country. The first set of stone buildings were constructed on the island of Viðey, once the location of a monastery off the coast north of Reykjavik, where Danish late Baroque architect Nicolai Egvad and his pupil, Georg David Anton, designed the residence and church for Skuli Magnusson, who was the first Icelander ever to become the bailiff, the landfogeti of the country, so the civil servant that oversaw the finances of the king. These architects operated as ghosts, as I said, from afar. They sent drawings, as did Eggved for the residents in Videy, but never visited the country. And so changes to the original design were caused possibly by local craftsmen who worked under the supervision of Danish builders. The National Archives of Iceland hold some of these 18th century designs, but we can only speculate whether they were sent to Iceland directly at the time or if they were later acquisitions. In any case, they were all signed in Copenhagen. As Eggved and Anton sent their drawings for Videy, also architect Laurits de Thura designed the Holar Cathedral on the site of a medieval church from the 11th century, once a prominent episcopal and educational center for Northern Iceland, which it was also shown in the Carta Marina by Olaus Magnus. The single nave church was built without bell tower and in local rocks with a very simple timber roofing. And Kristoffer yesterday has spoken about the Thura, and somehow I can see very few traces of the Danish Vitruvius in this project. Reykjavik's first stone building was the town's prison, which today hosts the offices of the government and prime minister of Iceland. It was a monumental building for Reykjavik's standard at that time, and yet again almost devoid of classical elements. So we might ask, what kind of architecture is this? This Danish structure seems to stand for a somehow classical narrative, for sure, although without the ornamental grammar of the orders. Possibly there are proportions, but there are no orders. And to me, they seem as if they were built to convey the solidity, the austerity, and the pragmatism of imperial power from Denmark to Iceland. As architectural historian Atle Magnus Zelov has noted, that the so-called Danish buildings, and we can argue about this label, Danish, were often way less ornamental and less rich in detail than the production of the same architects in Denmark. And the moderate character of such buildings on the island was surely not due to the ignorance of the architects involved. Eggved, de Thura, Anton were all expert connoisseurs of the classical orders, but the absence of Rome, and by Rome I mean an explicit engagement with the classical language of architecture, was due to several factors. Reasons of economy, as we have discussed also in the previous talks, authority of the Danish image onto the Icelandic society and dependency, as well as the absence of craftsmanship and suitable building materials on the island. Iceland was basically a province to be equipped with rustic and pragmatic buildings, and no more. We could go on listing more churches and buildings all over the country, churches in Bessastaðir, close to Reykjavik, on the Westman Islands of the southern coast. And these many churches could also be seen as a way to further ensure Danish culture onto Iceland 2 centuries after the violent killing of the Catholic bishops of Hólar and Skálholt during the 16th century Reformation. And Hólar and Skálholt were very important educational and cultural center for Iceland until the 16th century. And we also have another example, in Seltjarnarnes, where Jakob Fortling, who was a collaborator of both Eggved and de Thura, designed the residence of Bjarni Pálsson, Icelandic doctor and director of public health. So I often repeat myself when I say that the history of Icelandic architecture is a history of material scarcity, but in this scarcity we also have to count for the difficult renovation of buildings. These plastered stone buildings commissioned by Danish authorities were often fragile when facing the Icelandic humid and rainy weather, and they were seen as a burden to repair. And here we have a photo of the unplastered walls of the church and residence at Videy during renovation works possibly occurred in the late 19th century. So hence the preference by Icelander for a short time for the timber buildings for both city residences and of merchants and schools. Timber were usually imported from Norway and could follow the catalog solutions for the construction phase, as well as as was the case for the main high school of Reykjavik, built in the 1840s. Timber could also allow for a more ornamental approach to architecture, with a hesitant presence of columns, gables, and cornices above the windows, so connecting Iceland to the regional quality of timber buildings in Norway and Sweden. although the timber tradition was soon substituted with more resistant corrugated iron plates at the beginning of the 20th century, which also creates a material divide between Iceland and Scandinavia. In the second half of the 19th century, the ghosts start to appear. Danish architects became more and more involved in Iceland, and ironically, this happens simultaneously to the growing movement for the political and cultural independence of the country after the fall of Danish absolutism, which was materialized into the architecture of Reykjavik, now slowly growing into a capital city. Danish architects were more present, not as a symbol of Danish power, on the contrary, as a marker of Iceland's growing independence on building matters. They required these architects to be present on site. And this can be seen in the reconstruction of the Reykjavik Cathedral, whose works were supervised by the first Danish architect who visited Iceland, Laurits Winstrup, and even more in the design and construction of the Icelandic House of Parliament. The building was designed by Danish architect and professor at the Academy of Arts Ferdinand Meldal as a neo-Renaissance palazzo with evident references to the Florentine rusticated models. Meldal himself never visited Iceland, but sent a trusted collaborator and builder, Frederick Anton Bald, and the building became an open-air school for Icelandic builders at that time, especially to experiment with concrete, by then known with a new word in Icelandic, steinsteypa, so cast stone. The walls were made of rusticated dolerite ashlars from the country, created though an inside core filled with a conglomerate of sand, lime, and cement. And as a footnote, I think it's also telling that the project by Meldal is not kept in Reykjavik, but at the Danish National Art Library today. And here we see them together, the cathedral on the left, the renovated cathedral on the left, and the House of Parliament at the very heart of Reykjavik on the Östervöllur field. What we still don't see, however, is the clear presence of the classical orders, but fragments of it. So through ghost architects emerges a sort of diluted ghost of Rome, arches, balconies, and the rusticated facade of Alþingishús Hus, of the House of Parliament. The name Alþingi in itself comes from the ancient name for the medieval assembly, which took place at Þingvellir during the Icelandic Commonwealth. But I'll come back later to this place and its sort of Gothic character. So at this point, I would like to introduce you to a largely peripheral and unknown case study, which in my opinion can tell a lot about how the image of classical Rome circulated and traveled all the way to Iceland. It is not a public building, but a private villa built on the shores of Tjörnin, the lake around which the city of Reykjavik developed. When built in 1907, it was one of the biggest and most refined residential buildings of the city, boasting electric lighting and equipped with modern plumbing. The villa is made of timber and concrete, and it is cladded in corrugated iron. But what is striking, though, is that this private building is the first and only example of a construction in Iceland that directly refers to the classical orders of architecture. Its history is not based on ghost architects, but on books. The villa was commissioned by Thor Jensen, Icelandic merchant of Danish origins, who was very active in Reykjavik at the turn of the century, thanks to his enterprise, Korhop, through which he sold many commodities, especially building materials and also cement. Thor Jensen represented sort of a Platonic ideal of the wealthy businessman in need of self-representing himself through his own home. In his memories that are collected in the Reykjavik Municipal Archives and also later published in 2 volumes, Thor Jensen often stated that the villa was born out of his own thoughts. He often repeated that he had been inspired by projects and drawings from German sources, especially books, which he had consulted in the main library of the city. So here come the books. Which books might have been influential for the architectural taste of a Danish-Icelandic merchant at the beginning of the 20th century? Iceland is a paradise, I guess, for us researchers, because it's an island, so everything that enters its borders most of the time leaves a trace that is traceable. And so by browsing through the catalog of the National Library of Iceland and its purchases year after year, we can recreate the ideal shelf that was available to Thor Jensen in the years before 1907. That shelf was populated by books such as Katechismus der Baustile by Eduard Sachen, Geschichte der Baukunst by Franz Kugler, and the History of the Modern Styles of Architecture by James Ferguson. But most importantly, there were the many volumes of the German series Handbuch der Architektur, which had been published since the 880s and curated by German architects and engineers such as Josef Thurm, Hermann Hende, Heinrich Wagner, and Edward Schmidt. Who bought and read these books? This is hard to say, given that Iceland at that time didn't host art nor architecture schools, and so we can only speculate. But for sure, Thor Jensen did read those books. And so from this series, the German series of Handbuch der Architektur, Jensen most likely took inspiration for the layout of the home in the first place, which boasted a very unusual bow window on the western facade, facing the lake, unusual for the Icelandic tradition, possibly inspired by the residential layouts found in the volume on Wohnhäuser in the Handbuch series. But most importantly, via these books, Jensen might also have been exposed to the classical elements of architecture, and specifically the Ionic columns and semi-columns that populate the facade and the portico. We can state that the shape of the Ionic capital is a sort of a direct reference to that of the Fortuna Virilis temple, made popular by Andrea Palladio in his Quattro Libri. What we are looking at here is a translation of a translation of a translation from Roman archaeology to Andrea Palladio, to a German book in the National Library of Iceland, until a wooden villa in Reykjavik that operated more or less as a Frankenstein between the Palladian models, North American layouts, and modern plumbing. Interestingly, the villa of Thor Jensen remained and remains today the only building that actively engages with the classical orders in Iceland, and over the years it has been remembered as such. As you can read in the article on the left, this is the only example of Ionic columns in the country. It was written in 1969, and then since the 1980s, it was dubbed as Palladio Villa, or Villa in a Palladian style, Palladius Titl, by local newspapers and critics. It is indeed funny because Palladio was not part of the local discourse in the years of the villa's construction, and the first evidence of Palladio was the acquisition of a copy of the Swedish translation of the Quattro Libri, which arrived in Iceland in 1929, translated by Ebba Atterbom 1 year before. Nevertheless, the term Palladio obviously refers to the explicit use of a classical order, and possibly also to the practice of building through books, through prints. The villa was extraordinary in the Icelandic context at the time for its philological use of the Ionic order, and yet there was a short-lived legacy to it. Einar Erlendsson, Icelandic builder and self-taught architect that oversaw the works of the villa by Thor Jensen, in the following years became rather well known for buildings described as steinsteypuklassik by Icelandic critics, meaning concrete classicism. These were buildings in concrete, steinsteypa, which by then was becoming the most prominent building material of the country. Buildings that in a way somehow engaged with the classical elements, although abstracted and simplified. The plasticity of concrete and cement made it easier for architects and masons in Iceland to produce architectural details faster and at lower prices, and again, the economy. And these resulted in rather sophisticated decorations and abstract versions of columns, cornices, and crenellations all over Reykjavik and also other cities. However, these buildings owe more to neo-Baroque and historicist buildings and tradition than to the actual translation of early modern sources, of course. It's also important to say that this is a tradition that is very different from what we usually define as Nordic classicism in the Swedish sense. An example can be seen in the building you see here, a movie theater called Gamla Bio, with a structure in cast concrete that is adorned with a tripartite rusticated entrance and a pediment that rests on 4 simplified composite pilasters, bearing strong resemblance to eminent neoclassical models such as La Scala Theatre in Milan, as Professor Bevilacqua very well knows. Despite these attempts, and I'm moving towards the conclusion here, classical architecture in Iceland was short-lived. In the first years of his career, Guðjón Samuelsson, who was state architect of Iceland, the first Icelander ever to graduate in architecture at the Danish Art Academy, working as state architect between 1919 to his death in 1950, he experimented with classical forms on paper, possibly inspired by other neoclassical buildings in the north, such as Carl Ludwig Engel's Helsinki Cathedral. However, his visions for the culture acropolis of Reykjavik, that was a master plan for the hill of Skólavörðuholt, where Guðjón Samúelsson imagined a mix of museums and educational buildings, did not come to life. The architecture of Guðjón Samúelsson represented Iceland in a pivotal moment for the political history of the country, which became a sovereign state under the Kingdom of Denmark in 1918 and then fully independent in 1944. And over the years, we can see that Guðjón Samúelsson opted for an architectural language that refused to create a dialogue with the classics. What he built, in the end, was mostly inspired by a rather peculiar blend of concrete modernism, expressionism, Art Deco, and neo-Gothic features. Again, possibly another Frankenstein in this presentation. This is evident in the most important and representative buildings of Iceland from the 1920s and 1930s, such as the House and Museum of Artist Einar Jónsson, the National Theatre of Reykjavik, but also the neo-medieval Catholic Church at Landakot in Reykjavik, where obviously no classical elements appear. The 1930s were a time of Gothic renaissance for Icelandic culture, which looked for historic roots in the Middle Ages, in the golden age that the Middle Ages and the Viking heritage represented. So turf houses were studied again and imitated also by German scholars that possibly employed or used the symbol of the turf house also as a symbol of the Heimat and Boden ideology of the Nazi regime. And Alþingi and its 1,000-year anniversary was celebrated massively and in Viking style in 1930 at Þingvellir. So at Þingvellir, obviously, and not in front of the Alþingis hús in Reykjavik. And even fascist leader Italo Balbo, who did the travel, the 3,000 kilometers that separate Rome and Reykjavik, when stopping in Iceland during his crossing of the Atlantic by plane in 1933, was taken to admire the Viking heritage of Þingvellir, so forgetting for a very brief moment the fascist propaganda of Romanità. And to conclude, and I'm missing the last slide, maybe this is the, okay, it's here. Icelandic architectural critique of the 1950s was more interested in the neo-Gothic feature of this recent architecture, an architecture that looked at a medieval past, sort of a golden age for Icelandic culture and language, a moment to look back at with pride and to bring back to life when Iceland was becoming an independent nation. This Gothic and almost romantic fascination was also mixed with a nod to Iceland's geology and the shape of its basaltic rocks. Eventually, the buildings of the state architect stated two things very clearly. One is that ghost architects were a thing of the past, because it was now the turn of Icelandic professionals who were physically active in the country, and that references did not come from books anymore. In the years around the Icelandic independence, the buildings and their decorative apparatus rhetorically emerged from the land, its geology and its remote history. So classic architecture had become an anti-model, and Rome by then was again too far away from Iceland to be considered. Thank you for listening. Yeah.
Thank you. We've had a lot of fascinating papers over the last 3 days. We have not had a lot of time to discuss them. We don't have a lot of time to discuss them now either, but we have, I think, about half an hour or so. Is that about right, Mario? I don't want to do the discussing. I think this should be a group project. But I might start with just a provocative statement that I often wonder if the Achilles heel of art history is that it is written by art historians, which means that often we think within our categories which are taught, but they're not always necessarily easily matched to the way that people thought about things and understood things 300, 400, 500 years ago. We've seen a lot of things moving from place to place, people, objects, paper above all, which all gets transformed over and over and over again in the case, well, it's not, I keep pointing at a screen that doesn't have things on it anymore, but in Palladian villas in Reykjavik, for example, at which point one begins to wonder, what exactly are the relevant categories that are in play here. But with that, I'd like to open the floor to anyone who would like to begin to take on the next stage of the process, which is to begin to understand what it is that we've created here over the last 3 days. We have a microphone over here, but is there anyone who would like to start? Barbara. Excuse me, Professor Artashevska.
Thank you. Thanking everyone again, just like yesterday. I would like to direct my question to Gjert. Since Chris just mentioned Palladian villas in Bergen, I was wondering if there is perhaps a separate theoretical tradition behind these buildings. You said they were looking at Palladio. Were they looking at literature related to agriculture, the following of Crescentis and the like? Because I'm looking at these buildings and they seem to me reminding very much of the wooden manor houses in Poland, Lithuania, for which we have really developed a very independent ideological backbone rooted in agricultural treatises, again, Crescenti and Roman writers on agriculture, and I wonder if there is similar background to Bergen villas and manor houses. It's really quite interesting. Is it just Palladio, or maybe there's something behind it that's rooted in agricultural?
Well, 2 points. The first buildings I showed you were late 18th century, built by local master carpenters for merchants. They're quite small, they're quite independent of the Palladian tradition. I mean, it has entered the local craftsman tradition. I don't think these people actually read Palladio. But the early villa of the 17th centuries, they've been planned by high officials with some academic training, possibly also in some cases by professional architects. And then they have been realized in a cooperation with local craftsmen. I should very much like to see the material from Poland, because I've been told there is that sort of material in Eastern Europe. I've hardly ever seen it, because when you look for art history of Poland, Lithuania, or even Russia, what you get to see is the architecture of the capitals. You don't get to see this stuff. Exactly.
And for that reason, I was wondering if there is a kind of similar line of theoretical background for those manor houses of the 17th century.
Yeah. Well, I will guess that the intellectual culture of these two groups was more or less the same. Really, they've been studying the classics, they've been studying Palladio and so on, and they would realize their ideas through the local craftspeople. There's one difference. My houses are not really agricultural estates. I mean, they're only secondarily so. Agriculture is quite poor in the Bergen area. So these are primarily the houses of high officials who are just incidentally landowners as well. That's the difference. But in the terms of architecture, that needn't mean much. I would guess that it's very much the same culture, and you could possibly find the same culture in Sweden too, if you go into the countryside instead of staying in Stockholm. And even more when you go to Denmark, you will probably find much of the same thing. Yes, thank you.
Other comments? Yes.
I have a comment also coming from Gjert's presentation, because this raised a parallel or a second question. One is the royal architecture, the official architecture of very important architects that we have seen, but the other is the line of master builders, of a completely different architecture, which is made in timber. So this situation of timber covering the log buildings, which is very big in Finland, for instance, is just the imitation or the approach to classical elements which passes through builders, probably not from architects. And so this can be one question that we were discussing with Mario and Saverio, the materials, the construction materials. So on one face is the stone building, the official classical important building. On the other side is the timber, which is the material of Nordic countries. So a lot of, not in Iceland, but as we have just seen, but in all the other Nordic countries, the buildings are granite, but also wood. And this is a very good line of research that we want to follow. There are models of classical architecture in northern Norway, which are very important to be reconsidered.
It is a thing that came up a bit today, but it is worth discussing much more. Very often in the early documents, the fundamental distinction is it a stone house or is it a wood house, a Steinhus or a Trehus? And the same thing exists in Germany. Steinreich comes from a house made out of stone. You are wealthy enough to have a house of stone. And I'm glad we had it come up a bit, at least today. Saverio.
What Antonello said is a topic, a line of research, but sometimes we have a mixage between the two levels. For instance, some of the churches built in Finland or at the beginning of the 19th century, also from that one from Carlo Bassi that Anna described, are built with the classical language, but even if they are official building, but built in timber. We have some churches in Helsinki. We have just one timber church after the fire, but we have in Tampere, in Turku, in Hamina. We saw yesterday. So sometimes the two levels mix one each other. And this topic is interesting because it's interesting also if we look to the 20th century architecture of Scandinavian area. I remember this morning a topic essay by Paolo Marconi, who was a teacher, an important history of architecture teacher and restoration master in Italy, who in 1984 published an article on Gunnar Asplund with the title Sublime Way and Everyday Way. So to express the way of Nordic architecture in 20th century on the two levels, the official one and the everyday one, and that Gunnar Asplund interpreted in the bath. I thought to Gunnar Asplund also when Martin spoke it this morning, because I wondered if his famous project for the communal bibliothèque of Stockholm in 1924 or around, with a cylinder over a square building, maybe is a memory of the archetype of the project of Tessin. Maybe not. It is a provocational question, but it was suggesting that now come again in the speech.
Maybe as a footnote, a bit closer to this line of discussion on stone versus wood, I just perhaps will remind that there is still a great article not perhaps read often enough by Adam Miłobędzki in Artibusa Historiae, dedicated to these two great traditions of wood and stone building since Middle Ages into the early modern period. It's still, I think, quite relevant, and I think for those who are interested in these exchanges between formal vocabularies used in wood and in stone, that article is in English, so it's really quite an eye-opening for those who haven't read it. So thank you, and I think that's probably the last word on wood and timber. So anyone else?
I have just a short comment regarding the role of materials in connection to the use of classical models. And also at the end of the 17th century, so you can see the shift between the use of this, the bichrome between so the brick, let's say brick walls, together with stone elements, which is characteristic of Dutch architecture, inspired by Palladio, and so instead, sort of, when Tessin, for example, in the funerary chapel of the three abbots of Charles X, 11 and 12, instead choose to use just stone, which is light grey. It's not white, but so classical is white. So you when you deliver classical forms with an homogeneous, let's say, light stone color, well, it looks definitely much more classical. So, and this was something that was definitely behind, let's say, Tessin's choice of more, of course, expensive materials, stone, where I think that sort of is very well aware of the effect that the use of stone would have had on the viewer. So can be timber, but can be stone, can be bricks. So materials have important role in the, let's say, how the architects interpret classical forms.
Well, we had a sort of brief discussion yesterday in one of the intervals about what prints can do and what they can't. And one thing is that they are at this point not in color, and they don't normally inform about color. But when Tessin traveled here in the 1680s, when he came back to Italy, and he was interested in interior decoration, and he went round in the chapels and in the palaces, he always noted the color of the marble and where things were gilded, and just noting that down, because it was information that he couldn't get from his library. And another thing, I think that the reason he liked those studio prints so much was that they were so exactly measured that they had the depth. Because if you just look at like Serlio or Palladio, you can use it full frontal and get the same effect, but you don't really know how far set out from the facade the pilasters should be and so on. So you can see in other instances where people haven't been here to study that they get that wrong, which happens in some cases, other cases. But I think the print, what 2-dimension, how you go from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions is very interesting.
Absolutely, and always a challenge. One imagines, even if one has studied obsessively in say, a princely library, to come to Rome, to stand in front of, say, the Cornaro Chapel or something, and experience it in the 3-dimensional context, multiple colors, understanding that marble can exist in many different colors, in a completely absorbing kind of way. It must have been extraordinary. Yes, Linnea.
Getting away from Tessin and more spectacular architecture, I think when we talk about materials, in Sweden we have the publication in the mid-18th century, 1750s, mid-1750s, by Carl Wienblad, where he's summing up also how to build with stone, how to build with wood, and it's a handbook for the builders, where you have a lot of practical information on how to proceed from very simple models to much more complicated models, a kind of a handbook for builders.
Well, thank you, Kristoffer. If there are no other questions, but please do raise your hands if you want to.
I have a feeling that we are ready for a break and for lunch.
Yes.
That could be
We just wanted, with Antonello and Saverio, we just wanted to say thank you. Oh, we've made it. To clap to all of you.
Yes, and we already talked with many of you. We want to do the proceedings of this conference, so we will inform you in due time, giving a good timetable. And I hope that all of you want to develop or just conclude your work for the publication, because I think many new issues have been raised in this very, very interesting 3 days. Thank you again. Thank you to the Swedish Institute, to the National Library, and to all of you.